We've been fighting a long time, and we have all lost so very much, so many loved ones gone. But you are not alone. There are pockets of resistance all around the planet. We are at the brink. You have no idea how important you are. If you're listening to this, you are the resistance.
Ave Maria Stella, Dei Mater Alma, atque semper Virgo, Felix te.
Welcome everybody back to Steve Cunningham with Sensus Fidelium with Dr. Alan Fimister, a continuation of the Councils of the Church. And this week we're getting closer to our times, ladies and gents, with Vatican I, or the First Vatican Council if you're nasty. Doctor, how you doing?
Very well, thank you very much, I think. This is the biggest gap between any two ecumenical councils in the history of the Church, between Trent and Vatican I. It's bigger even than the gap between the Council of Jerusalem that the Apostles held and the First Council of Nicaea. So it's more than 300 years. And there are probably lots of reasons for that. But in a way, the story of what Vatican I is and what happens at Vatican I and why it doesn't get finished, because Vatican I was going to be a big council with lots of documents and loads of definitions, and instead it only produces two documents. They are unbelievably important documents, but it only produced two documents. And the reason for that is that the day after the second of the two documents was defined, the document on papal infallibility and universal jurisdiction, the Franco-Prussian War broke out literally the next day, and that led to a sequence of events which within a few months after the council meant that Rome was occupied by the newly created Kingdom of Italy. The Pope was a prisoner in the Vatican, and he wasn't able to come out again basically until the late 1920s. So it was very dramatic, and in fact, Vatican I technically was still suspended rather than concluded until John the 23rd decided to call Vatican II, and there was some discussion as to whether or not that he would just resume Vatican I nearly 100 years after it had concluded, or whether he would call a new council. In the end, he decided to call a new council, so he actually dissolved, in a weird sort of footnote to history, he dissolved the First Vatican Council. So in a certain sense, you could say that it's the longest council in the history of the Church, even though it only produced two documents. But there we are. One of the problems, so the story of how it happens is the story of how Trent, of the things that Trent didn't fix, and eventually why things went wrong. And although that's a long story, in a way, the answer to why it happened appears very early in the events immediately after Trent. So at the end of the council, at the very end of the Council of Trent, in the final session, the president of the council said, "Most illustrious lords and most reverend fathers, does it please you that to the praise of Almighty God an end be put to this holy ecumenical council, and that the confirmation of each and all the things which have been decreed and defined therein under the Roman pontiffs Paul III and Julius III of happy memory, as well as under our most holy Lord Pius IV, be sought in the name of this holy council by the presidents and legates of the Apostolic See from the most blessed Roman pontiff." And the bishops of Trent replied, "It pleases us." Hereupon the most illustrious and most reverend Cardinal Morone, the first legate and president, blessing the Holy Council, said, after having given thanks to God, "Most reverend fathers, go in peace." And they replied, "Amen." And then the Cardinal of Lorraine stood up and he said, to the most blessed pious Pope and our Lord Pontiff of the Holy Universal Church, many years and eternal memory. And the bishops shouted back, O Lord, do thou preserve for very long, for many years, the most Holy Father to thy Church. And then Cardinal of Lorraine said, to the souls of the most blessed sovereign pontiffs, Paul III and Julius III, by whose authority this Holy General Council was begun, peace from the Lord and eternal glory and happiness in the light of the saints. And the bishops shouted, be their memory in benediction. And then the Cardinal said, may the memory of the Emperor Charles V and of the most serene kings who have promoted and protected this Universal Council be in benediction. And then the bishops shouted, Amen, Amen. And then the Cardinal said, to the most serene Emperor Ferdinand, ever august, orthodox and peaceful, and to all our kings, states and princes, many years. And the bishops shouted, preserve, O Lord, the pious and Christian Emperor, O heavenly Emperor, protect earthly kings, the preservers of the true faith. And the Cardinal said, to the legates, the Apostolic See, and the presidents of this council, many years and many thanks. And the bishops shouted, many thanks, the Lords reward them. And then the Cardinal said, to the most reverend cardinals and most illustrious ambassadors, and the bishops shouted, many thanks, many years. And the Cardinal said, to the most holy bishops, life and a happy return to their churches. And the bishops shouted, to the heralds of truth, perpetual memory, to the Orthodox Senate, many years. And then the Cardinal said, to the holy ecumenical Council of Trent, let us confess its faith, let us always observe its decrees. And the bishops shouted, let us always confess, let us always observe. And then the Cardinal said, we all believe thus, we all think the same, agreeing therein and embracing them, we all subscribe. This is the faith of the blessed Peter of the Apostles, of the faith of the fathers, this is the faith of the Orthodox. And the bishops shouted, thus we believe, thus we think, thus we subscribe. And then the Cardinal said, adhering to these decrees, may we be made worthy of the mercies and grace of the first and great supreme priest, Jesus Christ our God, our inviolate Lady, the Holy Mother of God, and all the saints interceding. And the bishop shouted, so be it, amen, amen. And then the Cardinal shouted, anathema to all heretics. And the bishops replied, anathema, anathema. And then they went home. so that was quite a good conclusion to the Council of Trent. However, the Cardinal of Lorraine, who was the principal kind of master of ceremonies and cheerleader there, he was member of this French great princely aristocratic family, the House of Lorraine, which had a cadet branch called the House of Guise, which he belonged to, and they were very important in French politics. And and not only that, but they were, according to probably kind of sort of possibly reliable, but certainly generally believed in at the time, genealogy, were the senior descendants of Charlemagne. So they always kind of like made the kings of France a little bit nervous, because the kings of France had that kind of Denethor feel to them relative to the sort of Aragorn feel of the House of Lorraine. There was something, so now as the Council of Trent came to an end, France, the fate of France was in the balance. So the wars of religion, as they're known in France, had already begun. And the King of France, a little earlier, King Henry II, had tried to end the feud between the House of Habsburg and the French kings, which had kicked off in the 1520s or just beforehand, and but in the end was going to go on until the middle of the 18th century and be utterly disastrous for the fortunes of Christendom. But Henry II had tried to bring it to an end, and they'd had a treaty, and to celebrate this treaty, they had a big joust. And at this joust, Henry II was killed in a jousting accident, and his not very healthy son, Francis II, became king. And Francis II was married to Mary, Queen of Scots, who was the heiress to the Kingdom of Scotland, and had been smuggled out of the country to stop her being kidnapped by the English, and betrothed to the heir to the King of France when she was just a baby. And well, she was a little girl, so I think she managed to walk on the boat under her own steam. So this was a big power block, and she, of course, that was potentially arising here, especially because Queen Mary, the first of England, who had restored the Catholic faith, was just about to die. So so she her heir-in-law in England was the evil Elizabeth Boleyn, so-called Elizabeth I of England, who Pius V called pretended Queen of England and servant of crime, who reintroduced Protestantism into England. And but she wasn't the rightful heir to the throne because she was illegitimate, because she's the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who Henry VIII had broken with Rome in order to pretend he could marry. So in fact, so if Elizabeth is indeed Elizabeth Boleyn and not Elizabeth Tudor and not the rightful heir to the throne, then the next in line to the throne was none other than Mary Queen of Scots. And she started bearing the arms which would later be borne by the Stuart dynasty when it reigned in England, combining the arms of England, France, Scotland, and Ireland in a single coat of arms. So she was parking her heraldic tanks on Elizabeth I's lawn, but her mother was also a member of the House of Guise, right? This cadet branch of the House of Lorraine, and they became seen as the ultimate. I mean, Mary Queen of Scots' policies were not very well judged at all and went horribly wrong for her. But when she got back to Scotland, because her husband, in fact, only lived for a very short time and then died, and she was packed off back to Scotland by the Queen Mother, who was annoyed because under the reign of her son, the country had been dominated by the House of Lorraine because they were seen as the sponsors in France of Mary Queen of Scots. Now the House of Lorraine became associated with the Catholic cause in France, and under so none of the children of Henry II had any kids. So his sons succeeded each other in turn down to the last one, Henry III, and during their successive reigns, chaos engulfed France and Calvinism swept through the country, and it led to this kind of on and off civil war, which carried on until the 1590s, which is called the Wars of Religion. And it was all or nothing. The Calvinists were out to take over France and turn it into a Calvinist country. And if you want to know what that looks like, you just look at what happened to Scotland, because Mary Queen of Scots completely lost control of Scotland. In fact, she'd already kind of lost control of it before she got back there. And it became a sort of, a bit like Iran, except Calvinist. They were very logical, the Calvinists. So, if the mass is idolatrous, the penalty for idolatry is death. So the penalty for going to mass is death. So it's very, systematic. Meanwhile, the Catholics in France were pretty vigorous as well. And they were kind of like, well, this is heresy. It's just like the Albigensians. We know what we did to the Albigensians. That's what we're going to do to you. So there's kind of, there's a very, it's an all or nothing conflict. But in the middle of this conflict, there's another party, a more sinister party than the Calvinists, who are called the Regalists. So basically what they believe in is absolute royal authority. And they're not so interested in whether Calvinism or Catholicism is true. They favor the Catholic side in the war because, but very conditionally, because that's the majority religion, and that's what they think would be the easiest instrument of absolute royal authority for them. But that's why they're interested in it. They're not interested in it because their zeal for the Catholic faith. So you've got these three parties in this on and off civil war: the Huguenots, who are the Calvinists, the Catholic League, headed up by the Duc de Guise and later the Cardinal de Guise, and then the Regalists associated with the crown itself. And now it got pretty radical on all sides. The problem was that Henry III, the last of the sons of Henry II, he had no children, and he had no cousins within any distance, basically, of him in the male line. France is subject to Salic law. This is the cause of the Great 100 Years' War between England and France, because the King of England, if you allowed people to inherit through the female line, would have become the king. But if you excluded people from inheriting through the female line, then the House of Valois would inherit the throne. This was when the original direct descendants of the King Hugh Capet back in the 10th century, not to completely confuse everything, but his direct line died out, and so there was this problem which was about to recur at the beginning of the 16th century, occurred back in the 14th century, which was that it was only a relatively distant cousin who was now the heir if you ignored all the females. But if you didn't ignore the females, it would have been the King of England. So this problem was about to recur because King Henry III had no children, and therefore the next in line, if you allowed females, was the daughter, Princess Clara Eugenia, of King Philip II of Spain, who at that time was the leader of the military wing of the Counter-Reformation, and is a Habsburg. And but if you ignore all the females according to the Salic law, then it goes to like the 14th cousin or something ridiculous. I think it's something like the 14th cousin. So I mean, unbelievably distant. I mean, essentially they're not related to all intents and purposes of the king, of Henry III. And the 14th cousin of the king is Henry of Navarre, the leader of the Protestant faction, the leader of the Huguenots. So if Henry III dies, it goes to the Protestants. The crown itself will go to the Protestants. And then at that point, of course, the treacherous and not really very pious regalists, as it were, switch sides, right? They go to the Protestant cause instead. So obviously the tension is massive, and the Catholics are basically know that we don't care. We're not that interested in hereditary monarchy, that a 14th cousin who is the leader of the heretics gets to become king just in order to honor the principle of Salic law. And this is made even more tense because the leaders of the Catholic group are at least very widely believed to be, possibly are, the heirs of Charlemagne, right? So it's his dynasty that was dislodged by this king Hugh Capet all the way back in the 10th century, right? So obviously Henry III is very suspicious because he knows that all the Catholic League think we're not going to honor the hereditary principle in regard to your family if it goes to a Protestant. And the leader of the Catholic League is the member of the dynasty who most obvious alternative dynasty for the Kingdom of France. So we're looking at a massive tension here, and the Catholic League are very, very suspicious of the king. They don't trust him at all. The king's being much too friendly with Henry of Navarre, and they're suspicious that already even Henry III might switch sides to support the Protestants. And then Henry III murders the Duke de Guise and the Cardinal de Guise. And so really puts thinking, that's clever, that deals with the Catholic League. But of course, the reaction to that is absolutely nuclear on the part of the Catholic League. The Paris at this time is very Catholic, and the Sorbonne, the University of Paris Theology faculty, issues a rather pointed theological opinion / decree saying that tyrannicide is perfectly okay. By the way, chaps, just mentioning tyrannicide is often perfectly all right. And Henry of Navarre is excommunicate because he's Protestant, and so according to high medieval Catholic, theory of political power, he can't hold power anyway because he's a heretic. He's outside of the church, therefore he's outside of the community of Christendom, therefore he can't hold power. So then a Dominican lay brother called Jacques Clément goes to see King Henry III, says he has an important message for him. And so Henry III lets him in, and Jacques Clément murders King Henry III. So that for being a bad Catholic. So that's how hardline the Dominicans were in the 16th century, apparently. Might be overestimating this, but that you get executed, you get assassinated for being a bad Catholic, not just for being a heretic. He wasn't, as far as we can tell, an outright heretic.
Imagine that today.
So. Jacques Clément is killed by the King's Guard immediately afterwards, which is probably good for him because the penalty for regicide of French French law is to be torn apart by wild horses. So, so being killed by the King's Guard is probably the best way he could have gone at that point. The Pope hears about this and he delivers this amazing oration all about what an amazing guy Jacques Clément is, and how we should all praise him and thank him, and he compares him to, I've forgotten the name of the character in Judges who what does he do? I forgot what he does. But it's something to do with an elephant. Anyway, so he's like a biblical hero. He should be canonized. Isn't he marvelous? And but yeah, I mean, it's pretty amazing. And of course, the funny thing is, I mean, later on, I'm just looking something up. Later on, in 200 years later, the Catholic Church is seen in as the number one royalist group, the number one force for conservative royalism in the West. But at this time, it's quite the contrary. The Catholic Church is seen as dangerous radical nutters, Dominican assassins charging all over the place in order to bring down the baddies. In fact, King James VI of Scotland and First of England, Mary Queen of Scots' son, he actually invents the theory of the divine right of kings. People often think this is a medieval theory, but it's not at all. It's an early modern Protestant theory, and it's partly developed in kind of opposition to the extreme radical ideas of the Catholics against Protestant regimes in the late 16th century. But anyway, so Henry III is dead. That means that Henry of Navarre, according to strict hereditary succession, is now the head of the Protestants, is now the king. The Catholic League, which controls a large chunk of the country, including Paris, is not having any of that. And so initially they try and go for the guy who's the next in line after Henry of Navarre, and he is Henry of Navarre's uncle, the Cardinal de Bourbon, and he is really ancient and he's a cleric, so he's not going to have any legitimate kids, and he's really old. And Henry of Navarre immediately locks him up because he's like, and so the Catholic League sort of pretends that this guy, who they call Charles X, is the king for the time being, as a sort of holding action, because it gives them time to work out what on earth to do, because he's not going to have any kids, because he's a cardinal, and he's not going to have any legitimate kids, and anyway he's in prison, so that they can't communicate with him, and so they work on their theories in the meantime. And what they basically decide is that they're going to turn France into a sort of an elective monarchy, a little bit like Poland has become. So Poland, the royal dynasty in Poland dies out a short while before this, and it becomes an elective kingdom from that point onwards until it gets annexed by Austria, Prussia, and Russia at the end of the 18th century. And so they think, well, we're going to at least, so the Estates General will meet, which is sort of kind of the French legislature. And only Catholics will be allowed to vote for it, because the Kingdom of France is a community of the baptized, and you've got to be baptized and in communion with the Pope to be a proper, as it were, citizen of France. So they will vote for the Estates General. The Estates General will meet, and then we will offer the crown, and it does. They get together, this Catholic Estates General, and the plan is to offer the crown to Clara Eugenia, the daughter of King Philip II, so long as she marries a French prince. So what they wanted to do is marry one of the chief members of the House of Lorraine, right? So the House of Lorraine will be put back on the throne, and it'll be the nearest relative, ignoring Salic law, of King Henry II, and so you'll have this. In fact, interestingly, you'll have the dynasty of Habsburg-Lorraine, which actually does come into existence in the 18th century through a different marriage of the Duke of Lorraine to a Habsburg princess, from which all the current Habsburgs are descended. But it would have happened 200 years earlier, or 100 and a bit years earlier, in the 16th century. And so it looks like France is going to become a kind of royal Catholic militant republic. And interestingly, this is in 1589, so it's the assassination of Henry III by Jacques Clément is 200 years prior to the French Revolution. So France looked like it might have become like the most militant, constitutionally Catholic state. But then two things happen, one of which is definitely disastrous, and the other one I suppose we shouldn't call disastrous, but it's hard not to. One is that Philip II refuses. He says, no, my daughter's going to marry a nice Habsburg cousin from the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs. She's not going to marry a French prince. You'll just, if you want her, you have to have her as married to a Habsburg. So then that France would just become part of another Habsburg monarchy, and that's just too much for the even the militant Catholic League of States General. They're just basically Philip II says, just hand over the Kingdom of France to me and we'll forget all about it and everything will be fine. And they're like, no, that's just too much for them. So they can't, they're so frozen, their plan is ruined because Philip II won't allow Clara Eugenia to marry a French prince, and they don't know what to do at this point because they feel that it's too much, no one will accept it. And then Henry of Navarre possibly converts to Catholicism. Famously, he's supposed to have said, Paris is worth the Mass, or Paris is worth our Mass. And so he basically undermines the entire basis of this maneuver, which the Catholic League was planning, by saying, okay, I'll be a Catholic then. Okay, and they don't really know what to do at that point. So then he manages to get to Reims, and he manages to get crowned, and eventually, and he gets the excommunication lifted by Rome. Rome sort of kind of tries to be pleased about it, but everybody's a little bit suspicious. And basically, so eventually, what happened in the end? Henry IV, Henry of Navarre, returns to the old French policy of trying to undermine the Habsburgs' attempts to defend Christendom, and he gets assassinated by another guy in a street in Paris, and he does get torn apart by wild horses. But by then, Henry of Navarre has had a son, a baby, Louis XIII, and so it kind of calms down because they think, well, Louis XIII's a baby, he's going to be raised as a Catholic, so there won't be suspicion that he's a secret Protestant in the same way. But the effect of all this is that essentially the regalists win the French wars of religion. Now, the Council of Trent had been supposed to, if you remember from last time, consider the reformation of the princes at the end. That's one of the questions it was supposed to, and it never gets round to it. Now, in those acclamations that I read out from the end of the council, I mean, it's very prominent, the role of the emperor, Charles V, and his brother who succeeded him as emperor, and all this kind of stuff. And so it's very much an integrated understanding of Christendom that's expressed by those acclamations, you know, with the Pope and the temporal powers working together and heretics being anathema and all this kind of stuff. And it sounds like everything's all right there, but the fact that it doesn't, the fact that the question of what we're going to do about the temporal power and its role is never considered is a big problem. And the fact that the Cardinal of Lorraine's family never, in the end, ends up back on the French throne, and instead the House of Bourbon, Henry of Navarre's dynasty, ends up on the throne, and effectively meaning that the regalists win the French wars of religion. That's a big problem that's kind of lurking there, and what that does is it bleeds authority away from the church and from the papacy, because Christendom is a unit. You know, the kings are a kind of ruler, and within Christendom, the emperor is the temporal leader of the rulers of the temporal rulers of Christendom, and so the order of Christendom is fractured, and what it means is that the Pope is constantly beholden to the temporal rulers, the kings, for them not trying to do anything like Henry VIII and split off and try and create their own national churches. So the spiritual power is crippled in its authority relative to the temporal power, and cynicism has prevailed. So Paris, the expression "Paris is worth a mass" of Henry IV is kind of shadowed in Germany by the phrase that's used in the Peace of Augsburg when in 1555 when the Charles V gives up in despair at the idea of defeating permanently the Protestants in Germany. He has to do this deal with them whereby they get to be permanently recognized as legitimate rulers of their parts of Germany, and which shouldn't be possible because, you know, if you're excommunicate, you're not a citizen of Christendom, so you shouldn't be able to hold office. So that's seriously undermining the fundamental constitution of Christendom. And this prince, and in fact, Charles V can't bear to actually sign up to this, so he abdicates in favor of his brother, who's the guy Ferdinand, who's the one who's being acclaimed in the closing acclamations in in Trent. And Charles V retires to a monastery in Spain and lives out the rest of his life there, having abdicated. He divides his dominions. So Philip II is given Spain, his son, and Ferdinand is given the empire and the Austrian dominions. That's why there's two branches of the House of Habsburg from that point onwards. Charles V goes off to this monastery and surrounds himself with clocks for the rest of his life. It's very strange. So a bit of a nervous breakdown there about having failed to crush the Reformation, and he dies a few years later in Spain. And instead of Jacques Clément being canonized for heroically assassinating Henry III, the French Dominicans, my sister-in-law, who's a Dominican nun, was telling me that the French Dominicans were compelled to sing like an extra prayer of reparation every day for having been involved in regicide for the rest of the history of the Kingdom of France. So yeah, I mean, I believe Hughes claims, I've never seen this anywhere else, I don't think he footnotes it, but I mean, Hughes knows his stuff, so I assume he's right, that so bad did the absolutism of the French monarchs become that by the 18th century, they were trying to get the line, thou hast pulled the mighty from their thrones and raised the poor and lowly, omitted from the Magnificat, lest it gave people funny ideas, and they wouldn't allow the feast of Saint Gregory VII to be celebrated in France, because, you know, he was an emperor deposing, the great high medieval pope who established the principle of the papal supremacy over the temporal power, and so his feast couldn't be celebrated in France. So the Bourbon dynasty becomes extremely absolutist and also becomes highly dominant over the church, and this ideology of Gallicanism, the sort of national particularity and autonomy to different branches of the church, particularly in France, and the predominance of the temporal power over the spiritual power becomes immensely powerful in France and really, really weakens the church. Now, another thing that the Council of Trent doesn't deal with is the question of predestination, and that is a problem because in the end, the Protestant charge against us that we basically believe in salvation through works, which is very firmly anathematized as a doctrine, the doctrine of salvation by works, in Trent. But you could, depending on how you design your account of predestination, you can kind of sneakily reintroduce salvation through works by the back door. And this blows up at the end of the 16th century with what's called the De Auxiliis controversy. So the Jesuit theologian called Molina is denounced by the Dominicans and various other traditional schools of theology for essentially as holding to something like salvation by works. Now the Molinists, as they're called, who their followers of him would deny that angrily. But it is a very strange theory. So his theory is basically that God foresees what you're going to do if he gives you grace, with a kind of hypothetical foreknowledge. So God sees that if he gives Bob lots of grace, then he will do no reasonable good works, and he'll just, waste all of the graces that heaven sends him, and he'll live an immoral life, and he might scrape over the line or not, but he's not going to be a saint. But he foresees that Terry, if he gives him grace, will live a very admirable life and end up as Saint Terry. And so he decides, because of this hypothetical foreknowledge, to give grace to Terry and not to Bob. So Bob never converts and dies in his sins, and Terry becomes Saint Terry, and that's why he was predestined. So they think, well, that's not salvation by works, because none of these things ever happen, as it were. Well, they do happen, but one of them does, the things that were happened because of giving grace to Terry. But it's not that Terry's works prior to being justified caused him to be justified, because he hadn't done the works yet. These are hypothetical works that God foresees that he will perform if he gives him grace. Now, this is nonsense. I mean, a terrible nonsense for a number of reasons. One is that basically it's just a sneaky way of reintroducing Pelagianism. I'm going to get assassinated by Jesuits now. But anyway, one is because it's just a sneaky way of reintroducing Pelagianism. The other is because it's pagan. Because, I mean, like, God doesn't learn things off creatures, right? He doesn't. So either it's pagan because God is basically passively receiving knowledge as to what Terry is going to hypothetically do in the future. It's like, oh, that's interesting. Let's run the Terry scenario through the God computer and see what will happen. Oh, that's good. We'll go for that one. Beep. Right. That is completely pagan conception of God. People do things, including things they do freely, because God causes them to do them in his omnipotence. So he knows everything that's going to happen, past, present, and future, outside time, because he causes all the things that are going to happen, right? And that doesn't conflict with freedom, because it doesn't, because he's omnipotent and he can cause people to do things freely. But so either it just implies a deist conception of God, which would mean basically that God is Zeus, just a kind of lonely Zeus who doesn't have any other Olympians to hang around with, or that you could say, well, he knows exactly what's going to happen in these different hypothetical scenarios, because and they basically do say this as well, the Molinists, because he designs the circumstances such that you freely choose all the things that he intends you to freely choose. So God's will is sovereignly executed, even though you're free, because he cleverly, says pick a card, any card, and you always pick the card he wants you to pick, because he cleverly used special circumstances to cause it. But I mean, like, okay, great. So either we lose free will completely and become machines, or God becomes Zeus, or both. Brilliant. Thanks, Jesuits. So obviously the other traditional religious orders are furious about this, and they say this is nonsense and would more or less kind of make the Protestants right in their slurs against us. In fact, worse than make them right, because we'd be pagans as well as Pelagians. This causes a huge row. And the sort of leader of the opposition to Molinism is Domingo Banez, OP, who's a Dominican, great Dominican theologian, and the spiritual director of St. Teresa of Avila. This huge row kicks off, and the papacy is very uncomfortable with this, because the Jesuits are the poster children of the Counter-Reformation. So in the Jesuits' prestige is very strongly kind of tied up with this, and so they try and kick it into a committee, into the long grass. So they call this committee called the De Auxiliis Commission, the Commission on Helps, meaning on how it is that God, by his assistance, brings about our salvation. And it meets in Rome. It's summoned by Pope Clement VIII, and it finally concludes. Well, it doesn't conclude, but it ends with under Paul V. And basically, the commission keeps coming back to the Pope and saying, "Yeah, the Jesuit position is terrible, and you've got to condemn it." And the Pope's like, "Oh no, but what am I going to do? But they're on all the posters, and oh dear." So he's really, really worried, doesn't know what to do about this. And he says, "Can you think about it a bit longer?" And they're like, "Well, we don't really need to think about it." No, think about it a bit longer. So they go and think about it longer, and they always come back with the same answer. And he kind of adds more people who he thinks are a bit more reasonable onto the commission, but it still always comes back with the same answer. And so the popes are like, "Oh no, what are we going to do?" And so eventually Paul V decides to suspend the commission and not determine the question. And so the commission's final report is that there are lots of positions, actually, not just the Dominican position, that are not Pelagian, right? So the different religious orders all have their own different positions, but they all agree that the Jesuit position is heretical. So for like the Augustinians have a position which has a great name. It gets the prize for the best name. It's called Victorious Delectation, which sounds much better than the Dominican position, which is probably the true one, which is called Physical Promotion. Physical promotion sounds like you're pushing somebody off a cliff, whereas Victorious Delectation sounds great. But anyway, so the commission says, okay, we've looked into the Dominican position and it's definitely fine, and there's nothing problematic with it doctrinally. That's okay, no problem. And then they say through gritted teeth, and we have not had sufficient time to examine the Jesuit position, right? So they're not allowed to condemn the Jesuit position, but they just say they haven't had time to consider it properly. And Paul V says, right, okay, so we are going to determine this question. It's very important. It needs to be determined. We can't leave these kind of things lying around there for someone to trip over. It needs to be sorted out, and we will sort it out, but just not quite now. And that was, 400 years ago, and it still hasn't been sorted out. And he writes to the King of Spain. Philip II's dead by now, but he writes to his successor, look, basically, it's very frank. You can actually read it in the current edition of Denzinger, the big collection of doctrinal documents. I mean, it's not a definitive statement or anything, it's just a letter to the King of Spain. But he writes to the King of Spain and says, look, he actually says, I can't determine this question because the damage done to the prestige of the losing religious order, mentioning no names, would be so bad at this time that it just can't be done. So he actually admits the reason for not determining it. But the problem there is, and he says, for the time being, the Dominicans are not allowed to call the Jesuits Pelagians, and the Pelagians are not allowed to call the Dominicans Calvinists. And we'll get back to this question soon, amen, soon. And yeah, it doesn't. It's never been resolved. And the result of that is a further series of disasters, because people get very upset about the Jesuit position and they consider it to be inimical to the doctrine of St. Augustine, and what this leads to flourishing, because the Dominicans are gagged because they're not allowed to directly denounce the heretics, the Jesuits as heretics, and so instead people with crazy false ideas that really are Catholic Calvinism steal the center stage, and this is what leads to the rise of this heresy of Jansenism, which does enormous damage to the church over 150 years. And the Dutch professor or Flemish professor who invents it, and it's his kind of distorted version of what he thinks St. Augustine says. And he's quite clever about it. He publishes the book in which he lays out his theory posthumously. So he says, we submit ourselves to the judgment of the Roman See, he says at the beginning of the book, and then he has it published posthumously so that he never has to retract it because he's dead. And they have endless problems. The Holy See condemns it, and the Jesuits are cheering, which of course doesn't help because that annoys everybody. And he says that, and the Jansenists are always saying, well, we accept the condemnation of the positions that you've condemned, but we don't accept that Jansen actually said them. And so there's all these kind of wriggling around, and eventually the Holy See has to define that it has the authority to say that it's condemning propositions in the sense in which a specific person meant them, in order to that it can actually condemn a dead person's theology. It doesn't just have to. It's not just prudential speculation on his part that the dead person held the positions that they're condemning. They can actually say that he did hold them and condemn them as his positions, and you have to accept that they are condemned as his positions. So it's actually quite important, because in regard to Origen, because you get people who are sneaky Origenists who are trying to say, oh, well, Origen was condemned for positions that were attributed to him, but really, did he really hold them? Yeah, no, he was condemned by name in person, and it's been defined now helpfully by the Holy See during the Jansenist controversy. When the magisterium does that, you have to accept that it was the positions of that named person who was condemned that are condemned, and not just abstract positions. Anyway, so in the midst of these problems of the rise of royal absolutism, the weakening of the spiritual power, the undermining of the church's battle against Protestantism by ambiguity over predestination, you have there's a final push by the Habsburgs in the 17th century to sort of squish the Reformation. So the Austrian Habsburgs, since the two halves split off, have been a bit negligent. They've not been that interested in pursuing the squishing of Protestantism, and they've just been having a good time. And there's one of them is obsessed with astrology, really, and all this kind of sort of stupid stuff. And eventually, this Emperor Ferdinand II comes along, who is much more committed and zealous about the Counter-Reformation. And but during the long period of negligence, Bohemia particularly, which is very important because it's the Habsburgs' territory that gives them a vote in the imperial election, but was always very shaky in regard to its faith because it was the centre of Hussitism. It goes over completely to Protestantism, more or less. And when they realise that this hardline Catholic is going to become their king, they rebel against him, and this triggers what's called the 30 Years' War. From 1618 to 1648, and it's very, very brutal. It's estimated by some historians that more people in Germany died as a proportion of the German population than actually died in the world wars. So it's very unpleasant. But it looks like at various points the Habsburgs are going to win. And they have some very great victories, and they actually get all the way up to the Baltic. And no emperor has been really exercising power on the Baltic for a very long time. And they defeat the King of Denmark, who's a Lutheran, tries to intervene, and he gets roundly defeated. And the Elector of the Palatinate, who's a Protestant, who tried to usurp the throne of Bohemia, he gets roundly defeated, and his vote in the imperial election is taken from him. So it's all looking pretty good. But the French decide to intervene first with lots of money, and then eventually directly militarily to stop the Habsburgs winning the 30 Years' War, because it's the same old story. They're worried that the Habsburgs are going to prevail, Protestantism is going to be destroyed, and that's going to lead to the Habsburgs being too powerful. And so in the end, the French succeed in destroying the Habsburgs' position, and the war is essentially it's a sort of stalemate, but really it's effectively a defeat for the cause of Christendom and a defeat for the Habsburgs. And the Pope at the time, Innocent X, sees that this is a disaster. The Papacy again has not been as active as it might have been to support the Habsburgs, because they're also worried that the Habsburgs are going to become too powerful. This is the same problem that we had during the Council of Trent. But with the Peace of Westphalia, as it's called, in 1648, it's clear that this is disaster, and Christendom is now definitively broken. And this principle of cuius regio, eius religio, which was asserted at the Peace of Augsburg, the one that Charles V abdicated in grief over, that who is the ruler, he gets to choose the religion. That is reasserted again at the Peace of Westphalia. And it's a disaster because it undoes what happened when Christendom in the full-blooded sense was founded by the crowning of Charlemagne, which was essentially a statement that ultimately your membership of the Catholic Church and your communion with the See of Rome determines whether you rightfully exercise political power or not. That principle is destroyed by the principle cuius regio est religio. Instead, it's like which religion you're allowed to adhere to is determined by who your temporal ruler is, which is an abominable principle, and it's reasserted by Westphalia. Innocent X famously describes the Peace of Westphalia as null, void, invalid, iniquitous, unjust, damnable, reprobate, inane, empty of meaning and effect for all time. He doesn't think it's a good thing. And the French emerge as the most powerful state in Europe as a result of the crippling of the Habsburgs, and the Habsburgs. Because the Habsburgs acquired most of their territories through cleverly marrying various people. And in order to prevent themselves losing the territories by the same way, the Habsburgs have obsessively only married their own cousins now for a very, very long time. As we saw with this problem with Philip II refusing to allow Clara Eugenia to marry a prince of Lorraine, and instead saying she has to marry her cousin from Austria. And so they've been marrying their cousins from Austria like no business all the way through. And so eventually the kings of Spain are sort of, all they can do is dribble, really. They're not really, the last Habsburg king of Spain, Charles II, I think he has half the number of great-grandparents he should have had. because his relatives, his parents are more closely related to each other than if they've been brother and sister. It's absolutely ridiculous. And so as a result, he can't reproduce because his equipment doesn't work, so the Habsburg, not only are the Habsburgs crippled by the 30 Years' War, but they lose Spain at the end of the century. So that really does, so from that emerges the kind of horrible king worshipping royal absolutism of Louis XIV's France as the dominant power in Europe, and a kind of general cynicism. And so Protestantism thereby yields its bitter fruit, which is by breaking Christendom and breaking the principle that divine revelation is the ultimate principle of public policy and public law as guaranteed by the infallible magisterium of the church. That's all broken. It's no longer the principle of law in Protestant countries, but it's also no longer the principle of law in Christendom as a whole because of the cuius regio eis religio principle and what they call the Westphalian settlement, which is that effectively sovereign powers are immune to intervention by other sovereign powers on the grounds of their divergence from the divine and natural law, right? So that's basically broken Christendom. And what that does is it makes divine revelation absurd, because why would God reveal things to the human race which it's then impossible to know what they are? So he gives you a book, but nobody knows what the book means, and there's nobody supplied to tell you what the book means. And so consequently, so from the egg of the Reformation is hatched the viper of the Enlightenment, the so-called Enlightenment, no doubt after Lucifer. It's named after Lucifer, the Enlightenment, but the light bearer. So the purpose of the Enlightenment is to eliminate. It's a movement to eliminate divine revelation as a principle of public policy and public law. So secularize the Western culture, Western intellectual life, and Western law and politics, and anything about this. And the Jesuits, who'd been a bit very helpful in some respects and unhelpful in others, as we've discussed in fighting the Counter-Reformation, because they're a very fanatically pro-papal international order. They become the big targets of the adherents of the Enlightenment, and they eventually managed to get them kicked out of all the different countries by what are called the enlightened despots. So the various rulers of including the Catholic countries exercise unlimited state power because of the triumph of these principles of regalism that result from the 30 Years' War and the French Wars of Religion, and they're able to, and they're offended by the Jesuits, and they're spurred on because the Jesuits aim to be preeminent in all sorts of different intellectual arenas, not just theology and philosophy, and so they're an embarrassment and annoyance to the followers of the Enlightenment because they want to try and make Catholicism look anti-intellectual and backward and all sorts of stuff, but to me once, he said that if you want to understand the Enlightenment, he said, if you want to understand the Enlightenment, because he spoke a bit like this, he said, the first thing to realize is that the word philosophe, because the people like Voltaire and Rousseau and Montesquieu like to call themselves les philosophes, he says the word philosophe is French for journalist, and that really does kind of sum it up. So it's a very shallow movement intellectually. It's not able to engage the Catholic intellect on the actual plane of reasoned argument. Instead, it's a plane of political maneuvering and insult and attempting to stop people reading the actual arguments of the classic scholastic writers, just by denigrating this monkish superstition that shouldn't even be considered. Anyway, as everybody knows, this all issues in the disaster of the French Revolution, the viper of the Enlightenment that hatched from the poisoned egg of the Reformation, sinks its teeth into the decaying flesh of Christendom and forth its venom in the French Revolution, and which is the violent overthrow of the order of Christendom, and that issues in 10 years of horrible persecution, sort of Nazi style massacres of faithful Catholics by the French, the new anti-Christian radical French government, and eventually this is the revolution implodes under the weight of its own horribleness and is taken over by a military dictator, Napoleon Bonaparte. And Bonaparte now wants to end the persecution of the church, because he thinks that he needs to stabilize his regime by getting the support of the people who have been alienated by the French Revolution. And so he decides to go and do a deal with the Pope, Pius VII, who only just manages to get elected because the French government has been plotting to destroy the papacy. They abduct Pope Pius VI and drag him off to France. And they've got this very complicated, rather clever plan to announce extra cardinals have been appointed, suspiciously pro-French, pro-Enlightenment cardinals by the imprisoned Pius VI. No one was going to believe that. And then they were going to announce that Pius VI was dead when he wasn't really dead, and have a fake conclave and allow there to be a minority conclave of the real cardinals to elect a rival pope. And then after they'd appointed new cardinals and slung condemnations at each other, they would then announce that Pius VI was actually still alive in the French dungeons, and therefore nobody knew who the real pope was and who the real cardinals were. And so that when Pius VI actually did die, no one would know who had the right to elect the Pope, and that would destroy the papacy forever. That was their plan. But it didn't work because they were so nasty to Pius VI that he just died of ill treatment before they could set the plan into effect. And then enough cardinals managed to gather in Venice, which was occupied by the Austrians at this point, to be able to elect a new Pope. And they elect this Benedictine guy as Pius VII, and he's keen to end the persecution, so he tries to do a deal with Napoleon, and this deal is eventually concluded in 1801. It's called the Concordat, and it ends the persecution in France. And it's not a great deal. It doesn't allow religious orders back into France. They've all been dissolved and dispelled. It doesn't restore all the stolen lands of the French church that have been lost during the French Revolution. It turns the clergy into the salaried officials of the French state, and it allows the Napoleon's government to effectively nominate the bishops, but they still have to be confirmed by Rome. They have to be in communion with Rome. So, I mean, it's bad, but it's and it says that at this point Napoleon hasn't made himself emperor yet. He's called the first consul, and it says that the religion of the consuls is Catholicism, so that's all right. But it states it as a kind of matter of fact rather than a matter of law. And the evil Talleyrand, the unbelieving apostate bishop of Autun, who is this kind of slimy diplomat, politician, who's always surviving the wreckage of all the different regimes and driving forward a nasty Enlightenment agenda through each one of them. He's involved in the negotiations, and he manages to ensure that, contrary to the wishes of the Pope, the Concordat does not say that Catholicism is true or that it is the religion of France. Instead, it says that it's the religion of the great majority of the French people. And so this is a big step back from, again, so we've already lost the principle that the spiritual power establishes the temporal power and judges it when it is not good, the principle that was established by the coronation of Charlemagne in 800. And now we've lost the principle that the temporal power itself should be Catholic. Instead, so that was the principle which was established in 380 by the Emperor Theodosius, and that's lost by the Concordat. And we revert just to the period between Constantine and Theodosius, which was that as it happens, the rulers are Catholic. And that there is no persecution of the church within the civil order, but the civil order itself isn't formally Catholic anymore under the Concordat. And of course, the popes eventually fall out with Napoleon. He overstretches himself, tries to invade the papal states, ditches his wife without a declaration of nullity and all that kind of stuff. And but in the end, he is defeated, and Pius VII gives refuge to Napoleon's relatives in the papal state very generously, despite having been held in house arrest by Napoleon himself for a number of years. Prior to that point, the Bonapartes are not the most popular family in Europe by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and the Pope is very generous to them and looks after them. But in 1815, 1814 to 1815, it looks like the French Revolution has been defeated. So there's, and of course, how dangerous and bad the Enlightenment was, and how bad Protestantism is to some extent, as the inevitable cause of the Enlightenment, has started to sink home to a lot of people. There's a famous Anglo-Irish author, Edmund Burke, who writes this incredibly prophetic book called Reflections on the Revolution in France, very early on during the French Revolution, when people in England still think it's a pretty good thing. And he says, this is not a good thing. This is a very, very, very bad thing. And this is what's going to happen. There's going to be horrible massacres and brutal violence, and the king's going to end up dead, and there's going to be a military. So he basically predicts everything that's going to happen. So he's like seen as a terrifying prophet by the time all the things that he predicted happen. But he says, as the revolution develops, there's a wonderful passage in Reflections on the Revolution in France in which he describes the Enlightenment and how it was essentially a conspiracy to overthrow the Christian religion. He says that, a conspiracy to overthrow the Christian religion. And later on, as things are developing as he predicted, he says surely in his later writings against Napoleon, he says, well, Bonaparte as he is then, because Burke's dead by the time he becomes emperor. He says, surely the most perfect Protestant is he who protests against the entire Christian religion. So even though Burke is officially an Anglican, although there's some suggestion that he probably never believed Anglicanism was true and was secretly a Catholic, but whether that's the case or not. In fact, Pius VI, before he was abducted by the French, wrote a letter of thanks to Edmund Burke for having written Reflections on the Revolution in France. So Burke sees that, the Enlightenment is a conspiracy to destroy the Christian religion, and Protestantism is the inevitable cause of the Enlightenment. And he gets accused of being crypto-Catholic a lot. In satirical cartoons at the time, he's always depicted as a Jesuit by his enemies. So in 1814, 1815, all the monarchs of Europe, having defeated the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Empire, they gather in Vienna, and they hold what's called the Congress of Vienna, which is intended to work out, so what are we going to do now, chaps? We've had like 25 years almost of continuous war, and there's a massive ideological conflict, and now we've put the Bourbons back on the throne of France, and the revolution is extinguished. And the degree to which all the revolutionary forces seem to be on the back foot is in 1814 is often underestimated, because, of course, in August 1814, Washington, D.C. is reoccupied by Britain, and the White House is burnt down. I don't know if you're aware of this, because the US tried to invade Canada. That's at least the British account of how the War of 1812 kicked off. And eventually the British forces drove the US forces back out of Canada and carried on down into the US and took Washington and burnt the White House and the Capitol to the ground. And in fact, apparently the White House is now white because it's whitewashed over the scorch marks from the sack of Washington, D.C. And so, I mean, it looks in 1814 as if all this revolutionary stuff is over, chaps. And but several disasters, and the Austrians, the Habsburgs, are very powerful. They end up, again, mostly through clever maneuvering rather than lots of military victories, they end up in control of very large areas of Europe. They're forced to abdicate, however. The Emperor Francis II is forced to abdicate as Holy Roman Emperor while Napoleon is in his pomp in 1806. And before doing that, he uses his authority as emperor. Whether this was legal or not is unclear, but he uses his authority as emperor to make himself hereditary emperor of Austria. So he gets to carry on being an emperor, even if he has to give up being Holy Roman Emperor. So he makes himself the emperor. Francis I Austria, while abdicating as the Emperor Francis II of the Romans. So the Holy Roman Empire is kind of gone, and the Papal States have been annexed by France, and all the old medieval republics have been swept away by the French revolutionaries during their wars, because they didn't like them, because that reminded people that, in fact, you didn't have to believe in the divine right of kings to be a Catholic. So anyway, but the Republic of Venice and any others that might have survived are got rid of by the French revolutionaries. So the kings and emperors of different parts of Europe, they gather there at in Vienna, and they try to recreate. Well, they try to create what I would call a kind of Disneyland Christendom. So basically, they do restore the papal states, to the great gratification of Pius VII, but they do not restore any of the other ecclesiastical states, the areas that were ruled by bishops, I think possibly apart from Salzburg, which remained inside the Habsburg dominions. And they don't restore any of the old medieval republics. What they do is they make everything be a hereditary monarchy across the board. So it's definitely a kind of pursuit of the divine right of kings kind of theory. But they don't provide, but the rationale of Christendom is gone, right? Because obviously a lot of these people are not Catholics. So whereas previously you had a structure which was Catholic in origin, even though some of the areas of it had fallen into schism or heresy, they were still originally Catholic polities. Whereas now you're recreating these polities by an agreement between Catholic powers and non-Catholic powers. So the main sponsors in mainland Europe of the agreement are the King of Prussia, who's a Protestant. He's a successor of Albert of Brandenburg. It's confusing, but the dodgy bishop, you remember, he belonged to the same dynasty, the Hohenzollern dynasty, and his cousin, who was the head of the Teutonic Knights, had apostatized and created this state of Prussia. So it's actually the original Protestant state. So the King of Prussia is one of the sponsors, the Emperor of Austria, who's Catholic, obviously, and the Russian Emperor, Alexander I, who's a schismatic, they are the sponsors of this deal. So it's not really, it's an ecumenical conservative deal. It's no longer a traditional Catholic recreation of Christendom. And as a result, it doesn't have any real logic that holds it together. So the Habsburgs are left ruling northern Italy, which they had done for a very long time, but they make up this Disneyland kingdom that never existed, called the Kingdom of Lombardy Venetia. Just sounds fake. So Venetia is the former Republic of Venice, which the Habsburgs have annexed and which isn't restored. And Lombardy is the area around Milan, which they had ruled for a long time anyway. But they turn it into this new kingdom instead of the old medieval kingdom of Italy, which was based at Milan, which was always a bit nominal, but which the Habsburgs held as Holy Roman Emperors. They create this fake kingdom. And of course, the Italians are not very happy about that, because they're like, well, why do we get to? Okay, I can understand why we're ruled by the Habsburgs if they're the Roman emperors. Okay, that makes sense. But why are we ruled by the hereditary emperor of Austria? I mean, what have we got to do with Austria? Why are we ruled? That's fine because he's got a title, King of Lombardy Venetia, and you're like, okay, but where's that come from? That's completely made up. So the Italians are not very happy about that. And somebody says to the Austrian, too clever by half Austrian Chancellor, he is very clever, but he's so clever that he sometimes forgets that he's fallible. Metternich at the Congress of Vienna said, "What about Italy?" And Metternich's supposed to have said, "Italy, a geographical expression." So he's like, yeah, whatever. We've made up our brand new plastic kingdom of Lombardy Venetia, and that's how we're going to deal with that. So all the other parts of Italy are portioned out between various dynasties. The old Austrian Netherlands, which was the Catholic bit of the old Duchy of Burgundy that had not gone over to the Protestant revolts, because the Protestants in the Netherlands had revolted against the Habsburgs in the 16th and 17th centuries, and they'd held onto the southern bit and lost the northern bit. So what we now call the Netherlands is the northern bit that revolted, but it's reunited by the Congress of Vienna with the southern bit that had belonged to the Habsburgs since then. And it's called the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, and it's put under the dynasty, the House of Orange-Nassau, which had led the original revolt and had been the stadtholders, so sort of the kind of republican but really monarchical rulers of the United Provinces in the Netherlands before the revolution. They are now made the kings of the United Provinces in the Netherlands. And they rule what is now the Netherlands and Belgium, but then it's called the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. And the southern Netherlanders, the Belgians, as they subsequently called, are not happy about this, and they're very restless. So this is another sign of this kind of Disneyland Christendom arrangement is not going to work. And then there's the problem of Germany, the biggest problem of all. So they have to consider the question of whether to restore the Holy Roman Empire. But the problem is it's a bit weird for on the one, it's a bit weird for a bunch of Protestants and Orthodox to get together with the Catholics to restore the Holy Roman Empire, which is an intrinsically Catholic structure. So, okay, the Protestants have been working within that structure and occasionally trying to take it over and not succeeding. But the idea of the Protestants recreating the Holy Roman Empire really doesn't make any sense. Also, Metternich is thinking, well, I don't know if we really want the Holy Roman Empire recreated because it's elective and it's a pain trying to get hold of the votes necessary to make sure a Habsburg is elected each time. And in fact, that does go wrong in the 18th century in the transition when the last Habsburg male dies and his daughter marries the Duke of Lorraine. As we mentioned, there's this war of Austrian succession, and a non-Habsburg gets elected emperor, and so for a little bit, then the Habsburgs get it back. But but that was a bit scary, and the Habsburgs don't want to have to face that prospect again, and so they decide that they're actually happier with their hereditary imperial made-up title of Emperors of Austria. It's safer. And so they don't get the Holy Roman Empire recreated. So the key kind of structural elements of Christendom are not being put back into place. And so instead they create this German confederation, which the Austrian emperor will be the president of. But it isn't a state, so there isn't a Germany. There's a confederation of the German states, which is presided over by the Austrian emperor, and you'd think that wouldn't necessarily be a problem. Everyone can live in their own little Ruritanian German state and be happy and eat their sausages and sing their songs and drink their beer, and what's the problem? But the problem is because the traditional account of the origin of civil authority in Christendom has gone away. Right, there's no emperor, there's no supremacy of the spiritual power of the temporal power, and the Enlightenment has, and even before the Enlightenment, there's this idea of contractualist origin of authority, that it's because everybody agrees that this ruler rules over them, that which is kind of this substitute for the divine right of kings, which is an insufficiently plausible theory to really survive very long. But that's the problem with many problems with contractualist theories, not least that they always lead to horrendous massacring tyrannies. But one of the problems is that, well, who belongs to the contract, right? Who's supposed to who decides what if one part of your country decides that it belongs to a different contract, and or if I decide that I'm not in the contract while I rob this bank, and then I'll opt back in again afterwards when I've got my loot. Property will become sacred again once I own it. So it doesn't. So you need a kind of hyper realism about nations in order to get contractualism to work, and so you got to say that there's kind of there's just the real fundamental units of human society are these nations, and they're sort of almost platonic realities that have an absolute existence, and the fact that you are French or are German means that you belong to this nation, and therefore that's the contract that you belong to. And so the logic of the French Enlightenment actually leads to ultimately something rather like Nazism. There's a Jewish author, Hannah Arendt, who wrote this book called The Origins of Totalitarianism. She has some interesting observations on this point, and in fact, you see the fact that the kind of ultra left craziness and the ultra right craziness comes. They're really just the horrible twins of the same parents. You can see that in the French Revolution. When they all swear their tennis court oath, and they're all doing this Nazi salute thing, which is actually the Nazis actually get it from this, and it would take a bit long to explain. It all goes back to this weird painting, The Oath of the Horatii, by Jacques-Louis David, this famous painter during the French Revolutionary period. But it's all part of this kind of weird hyper-nationalist idea, and this idea of the general will, this kind of weird collective will of the contracted nation that Rousseau has. Anyway, so nationalism is the new Christianity, as it were, in the 19th century. It's the new basis for civil legitimacy, and the only way of avoiding that and its horrible consequences would have been to revert to the old Christianity and restore Christendom properly. But instead, they decide to have plastic Christendom at the Congress of Vienna, and it's not going to last when the floods come. So, but the popes initially, when Pius VII struck his deal with Napoleon, it looked as if what they were going to try and do is try and detoxify republicanism. They were going to try and get rid of the nasty Enlightenment parts of it, and see whether or not, as the church as such is not into Disneyland Christendom and is as happy with republican forms of government as she is with royal forms of government, as long as you just don't think that either of them is compulsory. And it looked like that, because Pius VII goes to Paris and anoints Napoleon at his coronation, albeit ominously Napoleon places the crown on his own head, which isn't a good sign. So it looks like Pius VII is going to try and find a way of detoxifying republicanism, having a more acceptable Catholic account of republicanism instead of the nasty Enlightenment form of republicanism. But of course, that blow, and in fact, Pius VII, famously, when he was just a bishop before he was Pope, he'd given a sermon about the theoretical compatibility of republicanism with Catholicism. She famously says, a quite ordinary virtue will suffice to preserve and to maintain other forms of government. Ours requires something more. Strive to attain the full height of virtue, and you will be true democrats. Fulfill faithfully the precepts of the gospel, and you will be the joy of the republic. So it's a very, very famous statement by Pius VII. But in the end, that never works out, because Napoleon actually quite wants to be a hereditary monarch of France and puts all of his brothers and sisters on the thrones of various different kingdoms that he creates around Europe. And so he makes a farce of the whole idea, because he's not really being very republican himself anyway. And then he's a terrible tyrant, and he tries to annex the Papal States, and he sets aside his wife and all this kind of stuff. And so he ends up being deposed. And so the whole kind of project of trying to reconcile Catholicism with some kind of non-Enlightenment republicanism disappears. It would have been very difficult anyway, but it doesn't happen. So instead, the papacy gets stuck with Disneyland Christendom, and the papacy is kind of like, well, that's all right. They gave us the Papal States back, and they're all very conservative because they have to be, because there's not a lot of rationale for this Disneyland Christendom. So just nostalgia. So they're trying to build a geopolitical order based on historically inaccurate nostalgia, essentially. And the Holy See is like, well, it's what's on the table, and it's a lot better than being massacred by atheist Republicans in the 1790s. So I suppose we'll go with this. And so from the time of Pius VII and the Congress of Vienna until the election of Pope Pius IX, the popes are very much backing the Disneyland Christendom project as the best thing on offer by a long way. But it is creaky, and it is falling apart. The Belgians revolt against the new made-up Kingdom of the Netherlands, and the French. Initially, the restored King Louis XVIII just tries to pretend nothing happened and just carry on as if he just happened to have inherited the throne from his brother Louis XVI. And there was a little bit of unpleasantness, wasn't there? I can't quite remember what happened there. And he tries not to offend the liberals. So the liberals emerge as this kind of party. So the liberals are, now that the Enlightenment is, as it were, over, the people who carry the torch of the Enlightenment forward in order to burn everything else down are the liberals. So the liberals are the continuators of the Enlightenment. And so they are, France under the Restoration is a kind of, resembles a little bit the sort of English constitution, a sort of more parliamentary monarchy, but with a stronger, actually monarchical government, but one that is answerable to a kind of elected legislature, albeit elected on a very, very constricted basis. And but Louis XVIII is planning to just pretend this is how things always were and hope that people will forget about the French Revolution. But then he doesn't have any legitimate children, so he's succeeded by his brother. These are all brothers of Louis XVI who got murdered in the Revolution. Charles X. Charles X is a lot more shouty about his conservatism and much more interested in actually undoing the French Revolution, and he does, and he starts to try and make moves to compensate aristocrats who had all their land stolen during the Revolution, and that makes a lot of people very nervous, because you have this problem that, you know, a lot of land that's been stolen has changed hands many times, and a lot of people in the middle ranks of society have their wealth reliant on the soundness of their property rights over property that was stolen during the Revolution. So that's always a bit dangerous. And he tries to make things much more Catholic. So he has a full, Louis XVIII never got crowned, because the coronation ceremony, where you don't put the crown on your own head, but a bishop puts the crown on your head, is very much the expression of the primacy of the spiritual. And so, and which is deeply offensive to the liberals. So Louis XVIII just sort of never gets crowned and just ignores the fact that he hasn't been crowned and hopes no one else will notice, because he doesn't want to provoke anybody. But Charles X is like, nope, we're getting crowned in Reims with all the proper stuff, proper rubrics, real coronation, and, you know, he prostrates himself for the litany and all that kind of stuff, and it's, the liberals are very upset, and he tries to get a law through making it a capital offence to desecrate the Blessed Sacrament, which is, you know, I'm all in favour of that, but the liberals are very, very upset about that too, because obviously that's, again, you know, that is clearly making divine revelation a principle of public policy and public law. So he's going full speed in reverse, as it were, and eventually the liberals arrange a revolution, and he's overthrown in 1830 and replaced by his dodgy collaborationist cousin, the Duke of Orleans, who along with his father had collaborated with the revolution until they realized it was too dangerous and ran away. But they are definitely seen as you know, the revolutionary friendly kings. So you've got so the whole thing's beginning to fall apart. Now, but Metternich thinks he can still hold the lid on to a certain degree, and they have this holy alliance, it's called, between the Russian emperor and the King of Prussia and the Austrian emperor to try and squish counter-revolutionary forces. And but the problem is it's very oppressive, because, as I say, there isn't really a theory, there isn't really a coherent theory behind the Vienna settlement. It's just historically slightly inaccurate nostalgia, and that isn't a theory. And so it feels very oppressive, and people beginning to forget about how bloody awful the French Revolution was and starting to get nostalgic for the revolutionary era. And so Metternich's holding the lid on with more and more difficulty. And he says, and when it finally does blow off in 1848 to 1849, and the whole thing falls apart, and Metternich is sort of driven off into exile, he said he'd planned for everything apart from a liberal pope. That was the one thing. Now, I think this is slightly unfair, because I think his plan wasn't that great in the first place, but it's true that a liberal pope didn't help. So in 1846, Blessed Pius IX is elected pope, and he is what Metternich means by a liberal pope. Now, it's probably unfair to call Pius IX a liberal, but he was definitely more of, he'd been patronized by Pope Pius VII, and he was definitely more of the view that there were forces within, there were elements within the grievances against the old order, as now caricatured by the Vienna settlement, that were legitimate, even if they were unduly entangled in false philosophy. And he starts to try and reform the papal states, to make them, you know, give the laity a larger role, have sort of kind of elections, have a sort of temporal government of the papal states that's distinct from the pontifical government, over which he nevertheless exercises a certain degree of veto power, and but he's really playing with fire here, because the thing is that it's nice to sit in your study and imagine a kind of Catholic republicanism which isn't entangled with the theories of the Enlightenment, but almost all of the actual republicanism in existence anywhere is actually entirely based on the ideas of the Enlightenment. And the liberals are kind of like, they manipulate Pius IX. They try and play up how they create a sort of impression of him as an actually liberal pope. He isn't a liberal. He's a faithful Catholic who is not very good at politics, and who sees that the Disneyland settlement isn't actually necessary, and is worried about the fact that the church could get swept away along with the Disneyland Christendom. And so he's trying to disentangle the church from that to a certain degree, but he doesn't realize how difficult that is going to be. And so mischievously, pretending to be admirers of his, liberals promote him as the great liberal pope. And whenever he does something which is perceived as liberal, they go and sort of cheer him outside the Quirinal Palace in Rome, which is now where the president of Italy lives, but was the residence of the Pope when the popes ruled central Italy. And then when they don't do things he does things they don't like, they're deathly silent about it, and there's no mention of it at all. So he's being engineered and pushed and cheered and sort of intimidated, patted on the back into more and more extreme positions until the entire thing blows up and he's driven out of Rome. Well, basically, there's a suggestion that Italy could be united in a sort of federal union, and that the Pope could be the president of this federal union. And Pius IX is an enthusiastic patriot for Italy, and he likes the idea of Italy being united, and he likes the idea of the Pope being the president of this federation, But the liberals and the Italian nationalists, what they want above all things is to drive the most powerful foreign power out of Italy, which is the Habsburgs, who rule this kingdom of Lombardy, Venetia. And so they're like, "Yay, Pius IX, Pio Nono, we love you, the liberal pope." And he's like, "Well, I'm not actually a liberal." It was drowned out. And Italia, and they're like, and he's like, "Yeah, Italia, let's kill the Austrians." And he's like, "What? Kill the Austrians?" And so he's like, "No, we can't do that because they're a legitimate government and they're Catholics." And they're like, "What?" And so then he is turned on by these forces that he has rather rashly attempted to tame, and he is driven out of Rome, and a sort of and a Roman Republic, so called, is proclaimed, and he has to run away to the kingdom of Naples, Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, whatever it's calling itself at this point, which is ruled by a conservative dynasty, although they're clinging on by their fingernails, and so he eventually gets back in. The Austrians, turns out that the Italians' military capacities have declined over the centuries, and the Austrians defeat them very easily. There's been a big revolution in Austria and in Germany at the same time, and the Austrian emperor, who by this time is the Emperor Ferdinand I of Austria, confusingly, because the numbering starts again from the beginning because they're now emperors of Austria instead of Holy Roman emperors. But he is not the sharpest pencil in the box. He's not like a great tyrant, although he's the employer of Metternich, who's been trying to impose the conservative settlement with increasing resentment from below. But he's apparently a little bit dim, and possibly kind of constitutionally dim, and not just didn't read as many books as he should have done when he was at school. The joke is, apparently it's true, that his only famous utterance was, "I am the emperor and I want dumplings," because somebody refused to serve him dumplings. And so poor old Ferdinand is packed off into retirement because he's just not up to the job of dealing with neo-revolutionary Europe. And his heir, Franz Joseph, succeeds him as emperor. And Franz Joseph lives forever and ever and ever. So Franz Joseph he becomes emperor in 1849, and he dies in 1916. So like he's one of the longest reigning rulers in European history. And but he's much sharper and more up to the job, and the Austrians managed to kind of get a grip on things again with a bit of help from the Russians, who beat up the Hungarians who were rebelling, and they defeat the Italians without too much difficulty, and they put the Pope back in place in Rome, and so an extremely chastened Pius IX, no longer at all interested in trying to find common ground with any liberals, is restored to his position in the Papal States. But the problem is that in the course of this, there's the Bourbons in southern Italy who are ultra conservative but not very competent, and then there's the Habsburgs in northern Italy who are seen as foreign, who've won on this occasion, but they're living on borrowed time because the nationalist beast is not going to be contained. So the only not ultra conservative significant dynasty in the Italian peninsula is the House of Savoy, who are a very old dynasty, who are the kings of Sardinia and rule Piedmont, the northwestern part of Italy, and they start to get the idea that they can kind of ride the tiger themselves. So they think, well, if we get seen as the patriotic, genuinely Italian, open to the new ideas dynasty, then we can end up being kings of Italy. So this is their plan, which they are treacherously hatching for the rest of the 19th century. So Pius IX is highly chastened, and the people loyal to the true cause of the faith are beginning to think, right, okay, the Disneyland plan didn't work. We need an actually coherent, integrated philosophy of what society and politics and international relations should look like, that's actually based on Catholicism, that actually has some kind of coherence, so that we can start, we can present a Catholic theory that's sustainable and can intellectually convict people, that isn't just historically inaccurate nostalgia, as an alternative to the horrendous spirit of the age, which is going to sweep us all away. So, and this has been impeded for many centuries because of the rivalry between the different religious orders. The same forces that prevented the same forces that prevented the condemnation of Molinism and prevented the destruction of the Via Moderna, the nominalist movement in the Middle Ages, the rivalries between the different religious orders have prevented the development of Catholic intellectual life to defeat the intellectual forces of modernity, because Catholic intellectual life is a perpetual armed standoff between the different theological schools sponsored by the different religious orders. So in 1849, the Bishop of Spoleto, who is Pecci, who is later going to become Leo XIII, in a general in a local gathering of bishops and clerics, suggests to Pius IX that what we need is some kind of syllabus which lays out a clear vision of what the Catholic response to the new things really is, and what the Catholic view of society is. And this is followed up by an Italian aristocrat who writes a book suggesting that defining the Immaculate Conception and tying to that a syllabus of the type that the future Leo XIII has proposed would also provide a launch point from which to make an intellectually coherent counterblast to the forces of liberalism. And the definition of the Immaculate Conception is symbolically important for two reasons. One is that the Immaculate Conception is one of those questions which has not been settled because of rivalry between the schools. So the Dominicans don't want it to be defined because St. Thomas denies it in the Summa, and therefore it will diminish the prestige of St. Thomas. And the Franciscans are really keen for it to be defined because Scotus taught it, and it will diminish the prestige of St. Thomas. But also because it represents it represents an assertion of the reality of original sin. Okay, so to say that there is one exception implies that there aren't any more exceptions, and original sin, which is a key revealed truth necessary to understanding the true nature of human social organization in our world, would be being strongly asserted, but in a positive way, right? Because the actual dogma itself is about the fact that Our Lady has been preserved from that. And you know, because this romanticism, this kind of movement of nostalgia, is actually strengthening the position of the church culturally at this time. Even Protestants, you know, see this to some extent. Lord Tennyson, the poet, famously refers to Our Lady as our tainted nature's solitary boast. But he wasn't a Catholic, but he was very keen on the Middle Ages. And then there's a third advantage to defining the Immaculate Conception and tying the presentation of the Catholic view of society and politics and international relations to it, which is that if the Pope on his own bat solemnly defines the Immaculate Conception, then he's making a very aggressive and grand assertion of the infallible teaching authority of the Holy See, which is one of the things that the Gallicans deny, and which is a key part of the coherence of Christendom, the fact that there is a certain reliable, infallible rule of faith by which you can know the meaning of divine revelation, which is necessary for if divine revelation is going to be a principle of public policy and public law. And of course, that it's necessary not just for popes, but for councils, because although people who are opposed to papal infallibility might hold that councils are infallible, but popes aren't, in fact, that becomes meaningless, as the Orthodox have shown, because without the final say of the Pope, it's impossible to put together an ecumenical council that anyone can absolutely definitely be sure is really a valid ecumenical council, because there's always some reason why you can claim that it's not legitimate. Right, every single heretical group that got condemned at every single council has some account of why that council didn't count, and therefore they're just adhering to the doctrine of the councils that came before that, which is the true ancient Catholic faith. They all have this thing. I mean, even I think if I remember rightly, the 39 Articles of Religion, the Anglican supposed beliefs of the Anglicans, although good luck finding an Anglican who actually believes any of them. But if I remember rightly, it contains like instructions for how to call an ecumenical council that would be a real ecumenical council, despite the fact that the Anglicans still wouldn't agree that it was definitive or bound them. But of course, they want to claim that they really, if only there was a real council, everything would be all right. And it's this impossible to fulfill rules about how every single Christian ruler has to agree to summon the council, all this kind of stuff. And they're designed to make it impossible to call a council, so they can claim that they represent the kind of conciliarist, anti-papal tyranny tradition, which they all do. You know, Luther appealed to a council totally disingenuously because he didn't believe the councils were really binding. So anyway, so in fact, papal infallibility is as important in a way for making councils possible as it is for making popes capable of teaching infallibly. But the Gallicans in France, one of their key claims had been under Louis XIV, they issued these 4 Gallican articles. And one of them was that the definitive judgments of the Holy See on doctrinal matters only become truly definitive when they are received by the whole church. But of course, this is completely subjective and has all the problems I just described. And so it's just a way of making it, we'll agree to them if we feel like it. If we agree with them, we'll agree to them. And if we don't, then sorry, no good. So papal infallibility is very important for the coherence of the ecumenical councils, as well as for the coherence of the papal teaching authority. So by solemnly defining in an aggressively infallible way the Immaculate Conception, which he finally does in the bull Ineffabilis Deus in 1854, Pius IX is strongly asserting the power of the Pope to act infallibly, independently of a council or anybody else. And he's done it in a way that ties it to Our Lady, which is a little sneaky, but is quite clever. So basically all over the world, you know, the pious love our Blessed Mother with you know, great fiery devotion. now anyone who denies papal infallibility is attacking the certainty of the Immaculate Conception. So it's quite a clever way of getting saying if you're attacking me, then Our Lady gets it as well. Are you going to attack Our Lady? So it's quite clever. However, he doesn't. In the end, he probably decides that tacking on a syllabus of modern errors actually to the definition of the Immaculate Conception is a little bit too tacky. So he decides that he's not actually going to do that. But he's still very much working on the idea, and there's this huge that's going on at the same time, a huge revival in scholasticism. So people have realized, whereas in the 18th century you had a lot of and the early 19th century you have a lot of eclecticism among Catholics. They basically just they adhere to the Catholic faith on a theological level, but when it comes to philosophy, they just like decide, they pick something that they like from the spirit of the age and go with that. So the coherence of Catholicism intellectually has been greatly undermined by this eclecticism and by the perpetual Mexican standoff in the Catholic schools. But in the wake of the revolution and the liberal resurgence in the early 19th century, people have started to realize that scholasticism is not a optional extra to Catholicism. Unless there is a perennial philosophy, unless there are basic rational categories which are objectively absolutely true at all times and all places and have been known at least since the death of the last apostle. So it's going to have to be ancient Greek philosophy in its developed form, i.e. scholasticism. Unless that is true, then Catholicism is completely incoherent, because the meaning of the doctrines that the church teaches is just going to change depending on whether you're a Cartesian or a Kantian or a Hegelian or Lord knows what else. So basically, and this is now a huge problem at the moment, right, and for many decades, is this idea that you've got Catholic divine revelation and theology, and then you've got the philosophy fitting, which you screw into, but that's optional. So, I'm a Hegelian Catholic, but, you could unscrew the Hegelianism and screw in Cartesianism or Kantianism instead. This does not make any sense. If that were true, divine revelation would be ridiculous, because what divine revelation actually meant would be determined by the optional philosophical fitting that you screwed in. So a lot of people are realizing this, and they're realizing that that it's going to have to be scholasticism. There has to be a massive revival of scholasticism, and if that revival is going to be coherent and isn't just going to be a return to the perpetual Mexican standoff, it's going to have to be a revival of Thomism, right? Because everybody grudgingly admits, and some people enthusiastically admit, that St. Thomas is the greatest of the scholastics, and so they're going. The Franciscans have been given the definition of the Immaculate Conception. So now, thanks, that's your special prize, Scotus. You can now go home and leave the stage to the angelic and universal Doctor, and slap on the wrist for having not agreed with the Immaculate Conception, at least in the Summa. He did agree with it originally, and then he denied it in the Summa. He may have gone back to it before the end of his life, but this is disputed. But anyway, so Thomas now had a slap on his wrist. Scotus has given his special badge for having got it right about the Immaculate Conception, if not about anything else, and he can go home, and in fact, Pecci, he is a big mover and shaker behind this movement, right? The future Leo XIII, and his brother, who's a very enthusiastic Thomist, and he sets up in his diocese a college for study, a sort of institute for studying Thomism and promoting it. But this also meets great resistance from within the ranks of Catholics, because in Germany has become very, very pleased about its own academic life. And its academic life is very, very modeled on a kind of universal application of the method of the natural sciences to each and all areas of human knowledge. So for them, theology is all about lots of textual scholarship and studying of history. And they see now, and there is a kind of a slightly distorted version of scholasticism, where you just spend your whole time syllogizing in a sort of quiet room on your own, and you don't ever bother reading the fathers. Now, of course, this isn't legit, but neither is the kind of theology reduced to historicist textual criticism, which these German liberals are keen on as well. So the neo-scholastic revival, one of the great figures of this is this guy Kleutken, Joseph Kleutken, who's a German Jesuit. And he writes these books about the true nature of philosophy and theology as truly there's the philosophy of former times and the theology of former times, which he writes, which become very important texts, and he becomes very influential. But there's another German who is his great opponent, Ignaz von Dollinger, who's very keen in this. Everything gets reduced to historicist textual studies instead, and he ends up as the great opponent of the increasing move for the proclamation of papal infallibility. And but in France, there's a great enthusiasm for there are opponents. There are old style Gallicans still there who are very important, but there's also a lot of enthusiasm for papal infallibility and ultramontanism in France, because the old idea that the French hierarchy goes back to the dawn of creation and it can't be touched by papal authority and all the kind of Gallican theories, they've been kind of ruined a bit by the French Revolution, because the pre-revolutionary French church was completely trashed. The French revolutionaries took the principle of national self-determination to the absolute limit of kind of, national atheism, which completely discredits Gallicanism. And when the persecution is finally finished by Napoleon and Pius VII in the Concordat, they just recreate the French church on the back of a piece of paper. They create new dioceses and they decide who's going to be the bishops of them and stuff like this. So the whole idea of an immemorial and untouchable French church is ruined by the fact that the Pope just recreated the French church according to a different model, albeit, and he couldn't be blamed for it. He was doing it because it was the only deal on offer to stop the massacre of Catholics. So Gallicanism has really suffered in France, and ultramontanism is now much more powerful there than it was. Now, but things begin to deteriorate in Italy, and they get worse because the Austrians are losing their grip on Germany, and the Prussians are beginning to scheme to try and gain control of Germany and drive the Austrians out of Germany. And one of the reasons why the Austrians are weakening in Germany is because the nationalism is a somewhat racist idea, and they certainly in its secular 19th century incarnation, and especially once The Origin of Species is published, and the German nationalists they want a united Germany as a state. They're willing to accept a federal state, but they're not willing to accept not a state, just a confederation. That's no good. And in their part of the 1848-49 revolutions, they tried to create a united German state. And they'd offered the Empire of Germany to the Habsburgs, but only on condition that they abandon all their territories that weren't German, right? Because they want a kind of ethnically pure German empire. But that most of the Habsburgs' territories are not German. They've got huge areas inhabited by different Slav groups. Hungary, which is an enormous chunk. At this point, they still have huge amounts of Italy. So they're like saying, well, okay, you could reduce yourself to a teeny weeny province of southern Germany and you get to call yourself emperors. And they're like, yeah, we're not doing that. And the Habsburgs are never really interested in nationalism anyway. They're always very suspicious of it, because nationalism is extremely corrosive to their extremely multinational dominions, which are basically little provinces of Christendom left behind after the disappearance of Christendom, which they've ended up as Austrian emperor of. So they're not willing to go along with this, and that kind of puts the power in the hands of the Prussians. So the German liberals offer the throne to Prussia instead, but Prussia turns it down because the Prussians are very conservative. Then they're Protestant and they're very statist, but the Prussian monarchy is very conservative and absolutist, and they don't want to receive the crown of Germany from pontificating liberals in an assembly in Frankfurt, and they don't think they could hold on to it if they did either. So they turn it down. But that doesn't mean they give up on the idea. Instead, they start to plot about how to get hold of it by blood and iron, as the Prussian Chancellor, or Minister President as he is at that point, Otto von Bismarck, calls it. Famous, gives this speech in the 1860s, where he says that the great issues of the day will not be decided by grand speeches and majority votes, but by blood and iron. And that's very much the Prussian approach to things historically as well. So Bismarck is a diplomatic and political genius, albeit unfortunately working for the wrong side and the wrong causes. And he manipulates German politics, sort of picks a fight with the Danes in a very complicated manner that it would take too long to explain. And tricks the Austrians into supporting him, and then stabs them in the back, and starts a war, disputing over. They get these two provinces that were ruled by the King of Denmark, which he wanted to but were German ethnically, which he wanted to annex to the Kingdom of Denmark, and when they declare war on him for doing that. And the Austrians and the Prussians together on behalf of Germany, and they beat him easily, and then they take these provinces and they give one of them to the Austrians. Foolishly, the Austrians accept the northern one, and Schleswig and Holstein, and the Prussians are supposed to govern the southern one, but the idea was that they were going to give that to a sort of cousin of the King of Denmark who had a claim to that territory, and he would just become he'd become a German prince inside this German confederation, and that'd be the end of it. But instead, the Prussians just basically annex the territory. And the Austrians get annoyed about that, as Bismarck intended they should get annoyed about it, because the whole thing was a setup from the start. And so the Austrians declare war on the Prussians, and then the Prussians beat the crap out of them, basically. And in 7 weeks, it's called the 7 Weeks' War. It's very humiliating. And the Prussians join up with the Kingdom of Sardinia, the ones who are trying to ride the nationalist tiger in Italy, and they force the Austrians to give up their remaining territories in Italy at the same time. So the Austrians, through combined treachery of the French ruler Napoleon III a little bit earlier, and the cunning of the Prussians, are driven out of Germany and are driven out of Italy. And so they're sort of, and now they kind of have to sit there and be told what to do by the Hungarians, because they're now the largest group in the empire, as in its abbreviated form. So Pius IX basically realizes that the writing is on the wall, right? And he hasn't got much time left now. So 10 years, and this has slowly been going on since the defeat of those revolutions in 1848, 1849. So 10 years after to the day. So although he doesn't tie them together, initially he ties them together symbolically. So on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, which was the day that the dogma was proclaimed, 10 years after the Immaculate Conception, Pius IX issues an encyclical, Quanta Cura, which is an infallible statement. It solemnly condemns by his apostolical authority the errors, the principal errors of the day, and he adds to that a syllabus of modern errors, which is a much longer document with 80 odd condemned errors of modernity, going into much more detail, which isn't infallible. So the syllabus of modern errors is a series of errors which he's condemned at various different points in different speeches and things, and they're all put together in a list of all the errors of the day. And then Quanta Cura it's about 10 or so the really fundamental points, and solemnly condemns them. And in fact, people basically ignore Quanta Cura. It's terrible. In fact, the Denzinger, the current edition of Denzinger, which is the problem with the successive editions of Denzinger, is that although the more research is done with each edition, so you get more footnotes and more documents that were previously overlooked, but also it's kind of got more liberal as the different editions have come out. And Quanta Cura, some key elements of Quanta Cura are just missing from Denzinger. They were there in earlier editions and they're not in the current edition. It's terrifying, because I mean, it says in the in fact, there's still a number for it, so you'll notice you skip a number when you come to that section in Denzinger, but it's just not there in the text, and it's really bad, because it's the. I mean, if you look at the formula by which Pius X condemned these errors, he's like, we by our apostolical authority, condemn absolutely all of these pernicious and terrible errors, and command that all the Catholic faithful must hold them as condemned and pernicious. So it's clearly an infallible definition. But anyway, so there's now kind of a plan at least expressed in negative terms, but nevertheless, there is a sketch in shadow of what the Catholic answer to these great issues of the day is, from the point of from 1864 and the promulgation of Quanta Cura and the Syllabus of Errors. Now, in 1867, as the skies are darkening further for the papacy and its temporal rule in central Italy, the Pope holds a big celebration of the anniversary of the martyrdom of Saints Peter and Paul. And lots and lots of bishops come to this celebration, and it is suggested at it that perhaps the time has come to call an ecumenical council to deal with the great issues of the day, and all these questions which have come up. And now, papal infallibility is not heavily pushed yet, but it's in the air as one of the things that this council is going to deal with. But it's generally the modern errors which is thought of as the most important things which are going to have to be dealt with, and a sort of general updating of Trent. You know, more things to deal with, problems that either Trent hadn't dealt with or where the realities have shifted a bit, and therefore new things need to be dealt with. And the following year he summons an ecumenical council. Now at this meeting, Manning, who is the Archbishop of Westminster in the restored hierarchy of England, which actually during the chaos of the Roman Republic and the driving of the Pope out of Rome, the Pope had actually got round to restoring bishops to England, which there hadn't been since the late 16th century, since the last valid bishops died out after Elizabeth Boleyn created the Church of England. And so Manning becomes one of the great cheerleaders of the idea of defining papal infallibility, and him and a number of other people who are very ultramontane get together, and they sort of have this pact that we are going to make sure that papal infallibility gets defined at this ecumenical council. And so, in fact, a lot of people think that the sinister Rhine group at the Second Vatican Council looked back on the First Vatican Council and saw how incredibly effective Manning and his fellow infallibilists were in plotting in advance to sort of make sure they got control of the procedural mechanisms of Vatican I to ensure that that there was a definition of papal infallibility, that they kind of modeled their own strategy to undo much of that work on his own tactics. But they're very vigorous about this. And now, as I say, the principal purpose of the council is not at all mentioned to be defining papal infallibility, but everybody starts talking about it, that's what's going to happen. And so they get together various commissions to work on preparatory documents, and in fact, although after the council, the defeated liberals try and claim that it was all manipulated and it was a tyrannical papal council and there was nothing you could do and everyone was terrified, and they had their own pet journalists in Rome at the time coming up with completely fraudulent claims to this effect to try and poison the presentation of the council back in the various different countries. In fact, the Pius IX picks a German bishop who is an outspoken opponent of the definition of papal infallibility to be the chief expert to design all the procedural rules of the council. So there's no legitimacy to this claim at all. But so the council begins its sessions in 1869. By which time the Austrians have been driven out of any role in Germany, and Bismarck is plotting the final stages in the conquest of Germany for Prussia, and but nobody realizes quite how advanced this plan is at this point. Rome is defended from being captured. So by this point, the Garibaldi, leading the ideological secular Italian nationalists, has managed to conquer the kingdom of the Two Sicilies in the south, and he hands it over to the King of Sardinia in the north. So the Papal States are surrounded by a new kingdom of Italy, which has been declared, which, however, doesn't include Rome and the territory around Rome itself. But they don't have the Pope. He has lots of volunteers. Commanded by the grandson of one of the heroes of the Vendéan revolt, in fact. But he doesn't have a big enough army to actually really defend Rome against a direct assault from this new kingdom of Italy. But Napoleon III in France, who came to power after the collapse of the liberal monarchy of Louis Philippe, the Duke of Orleans, the collaborationist cousin of the rightful French kings, he wasn't very effective as king, got driven out, and eventually Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon, was elected president of France, and he eventually gets himself proclaimed emperor. But he has the backing of a lot of Catholics who didn't like Louis Philippe and are worried about secularist forces. And so he's in a funny position because Napoleon III is seen as the champion of the self-determination of nations and of liberalism, but he's also seen as the savior of Catholicism from more extreme secular Enlightenment forces. And so he kind of partly helps and partly hinders the Italian nationalists. But by this point, they've proclaimed their kingdom of Italy. They've stolen large chunks of the Papal States. They've got control of the south and the north. And as far as Napoleon III is concerned, he's given enough to the liberal wing of his base. He can't afford to give any more to it. So he sends troops into Rome to defend the Papal States against any further conquests by the Italian nationalists. So it's in this very difficult situation that this ecumenical council is summoned. And there are 5 different deputations who are in charge of preparing schemas on different subjects. And the most important document in some ways of the council is one which Clément, the neo-Thomist or neo-scholastic Thomist revivalist figure, is heavily influential in, which is eventually becomes the dogmatic constitution Dei Filius, on divine revelation. And it contains an awful lot of material, many anathemas. It's all solemnly defined right from the beginning. And it begins with a wonderful, let's see if I can find it, a wonderful description of what's happened since Trent. Let's see, where are you? Dei Filius, come on, that makes sense. Basically describing how events have developed over those different centuries. Let's have a look at the beginning of Dei Filius. Here we are. So he describes his general sort of stuff about how marvelous Trent was and all the wonderful things that Trent did, and then it moves on to explaining the things that went wrong. And it says, so this is actually a dogmatic constitution solemnly defined by an ecumenical council. It says, everybody knows that those heresies condemned by the fathers of Trent, which rejected the divine magisterium of the church and allowed religious questions to be a matter for the judgment of each individual, have gradually collapsed into a multiplicity of sects, either at variance or in agreement with one another. And by this means, a good many people have had all faith in Christ destroyed. Indeed, even the Holy Bible itself, which they at once claimed to be the sole source and judge of the Christian faith, is no longer held to be divine, but they begin to assimilate it to the inventions of myth. So this is a description of how the logic of Protestantism itself has led to the breakdown of Christianity as such, and to sort of absurd liberal Protestantism, which believes in almost nothing. Thereupon, the council continues, there came into being and spread far and wide throughout the world that doctrine of rationalism or naturalism, utterly opposed to the Christian religion, since this is of supernatural origin, which spares no effort to bring it about that Christ, who alone is our Lord and Saviour, is shut out from the minds of people and the moral life of nations. Thus they would establish what they call the rule of simple reason or nature. The abandonment and rejection of the Christian religion and the denial of God and his Christ has plunged the minds of many into the abyss of pantheism, materialism, and atheism, and the consequence is that they strive to destroy rational nature itself, to deny any criterion of what is right and just, and to overthrow the very foundations of human society. So, I mean, it's an absolutely brilliant description of how the Reformation led to the terrible things which, in the midst of which we now live, is brilliantly described there by a solemn document of an ecumenical council. And so it goes out there and it really takes down all of these. It solemnly defines the error of all of these things, and So it goes for the philosophy screw unscrew different fittings theory, that you can change the meaning of divine revelation by fiddling with the philosophical categories in which it's expressed. It defines, if anyone shall give a meaning to the doctrines taught by the church as a result of the progress of knowledge different from that by which they have been understood and are now understood, let him be anathema, right? So that's boomf. All these people trying to create syntheses of evolution or Freudianism or Lord knows what else with Catholicism, they get lost. It was all solemnly condemned by the First Vatican Council. Then, of course, the key philosophical claim for the establishment of Christendom, for the re-establishment of Christendom, is that we know by natural reason that God exists. And therefore we know by natural reason that we are obliged to give private and public worship to him, right? And and we must find what the true religion is and embrace it, right? That's the key first plank in any general restoration. And so Vatican I in De Filius solemnly defines that. It says, if anyone shall say that the one true God, our creator and Lord, may not be certainly known from the things that have been made by the natural light of human reason, let him be anathema, right? So that you can prove the existence of God by natural reason is solemnly defined. They're very careful about any false doctrines of doctrinal development, so at the end of the prose section of De Filius, they say, and so we, following the precept footsteps of our predecessors, in accordance with our supreme apostolic office, have never left off teaching and defending Catholic truth and condemning erroneous doctrines. But now it is our purpose to profess and declare from this chair of Peter, before all eyes, the saving teaching of Christ, and by the power given to us by God, to reject and condemn the contrary errors. Hang on, I'm just trying to find where he actually gets to the. A little bit later, he says, may understanding. So hence too, that meaning of the sacred dogmas is ever to be maintained, which has once been declared by Holy Mother Church, and there must never be any abandonment of this sense under the pretext or in the name of a more profound understanding. May understanding, knowledge, and wisdom increase as ages and centuries roll along and greatly and vigorously flourish in each and all, in all the individuals and in the whole Church, but this only in its own proper kind, that is to say, in the same doctrine, the same sense, and the same understanding. So they're careful to allow for a concept of doctrinal development, but not one that involves it developing into meaning the opposite of what it meant beforehand, right? Which is what most people who invoke the concept nowadays mean by the subject, by the concept. So we obviously don't have time to go through every single anathema of De Filius. There's an awful lot in there, but it's really, really, really worth reading. It's absolutely brilliant, and it's the beginning of the coordinated counterattack to modernity that's going to really flourish under Leo XIII and Pius X. Now, however, there's a slight clericalist fly in the ointment, which is that they're so worried about how difficult the situation with temporal rulers has become, and who counts as a Catholic temporal ruler and who doesn't, and who could be trusted, and who they would invite to the council to send ambassadors if they were to invite the Catholic princes, that they decide to just not mention it. So in the bull in which the council is summoned, it sort of says that they assume, of course, that the Catholic temporal rulers will do their best to facilitate the council, but there's no invitation to them to send any ambassadors or anything like that. And that's a big problem, right? Because that reinforces this idea of the church being the clergy. And the Prime Minister of France at the time, the Prime Minister under the Emperor Napoleon III, Émile Olivier, who's actually an agnostic, who subsequently goes on to write a very good history of the council, which refutes a lot of the nonsense which the liberals who lost and are angry about the council are trying to promote. Nevertheless, he says at the time, he says, by not inviting the lay rulers to send ambassadors, Pius IX has proclaimed the separation of church and state. Now that's obviously he's being mischievous, right? But I mean, but in a way, that's kind of true, really, because the clergy, the bishops aren't elected by the laity anymore, haven't been for a very long time. And so the only real expression of the fact that the church isn't just the clergy, but is the whole of the faithful that remains, is the role which temporal Christian rulers play in ecclesiastical affairs. And by not inviting the ambassadors of the princes of Christendom to the council, Pius IX has, in an inadvertent way, kind of proclaimed the separation of church and state, which is definitely not what the plan was. Okay, but that's a little cloud no smaller than a man's hand looming in the background. But anyway, so as they realize that things are getting bad and that there's a danger of the congregation's taking a very long time to debate things, and there's a danger that the council won't be able to do as much as it was planning to do if the machinations of the new Kingdom of Italy and of the Prussians get really out of hand, there starts to become big pressure from the Infallibilists, who've managed to get control of the delegation Dei Fide, whose job it is to put together the draft documents on doctrinal topics. There's a big push to have instead of a general, very long document that deals with lots of different questions about ecclesiology, about the nature of the church, which is the plan. It was the original plan and is still the plan. But instead of having that as one big document, they say, well, why don't we deal with what the authority of the Pope is in a distinct document, which we can definitely get done, and then we'll deal with that. And then once that's in the bag, we can sort out the rest. Now, the people who are opposed to the definition of papal infallibility fall into two different groups. There are the inopportunists, who are the people who think that it's true, but it's a bad idea to define it. And they basically think it's a bad idea to define it either because it's going to cause Protestants to become even more hostile to the church and it'll be harder to convert them, or they hold that it's a bad idea to define it because secretly they think it isn't true, but they don't want to admit it because it's very popular, or they think it's a bad idea to define it because they think that the popes will go nuts once it's been defined, that the fact that it hasn't been defined causes them to be worried about people denying it. And so they think twice and three times before doing things. Whereas once you hand them the big nuclear button of papal infallibility, they're just going to go mad and start machine gunning everybody with documents, which is in fact what happens. Not everybody who's an inopportunist is a bad guy who secretly denies the doctrine. Some of them didn't. Some of them, or just a weak-kneed ecumenist who doesn't want to upset the Protestants by telling them too many true things in one go. There are people who have more sensible reasons for thinking that it's inopportune. But anyway, so some of them get really freaked out because at one point, in the preparations for the council, the Pope asks for his representatives in France to send him a confidential account of what people in France are thinking about papal infallibility and whether it's a good idea. And he gets sent back a very enthusiastic account of how there's an awful lot of support for it in France, and that some people are actually saying that it ought to be declared by acclamation, as if like the council wouldn't really be necessary anymore. They just gather all the bishops. The Pope comes into St. Peter's Basilica and says, "Am I infallible?" And they go, "Yes, you're infallible." And what do we say to people who say you're not infallible? Anathema. And he says, "Great, you can all go home now. I'll deal with it from here. No need for any more councils because I'm infallible and I can do it all myself." And so this irresponsible and not sensible suggestion is mentioned in this report. And Pius IX, rather mischievously, I'm not quite sure, well, it's actually his Secretary of State who does it, but I'm not sure whether he's trying to build a position for himself by having a more extreme, scary position to hold over the inopportunists as a kind of, if you don't let me have my definition, then you're going to get this instead. But he basically hands over this document to La Civiltà Cattolica, the Jesuit semi-official journal, which has become very important in the decades preceding the council, and they just print it as from a French observer or something, and this causes complete panic among the inopportunists. So it may have been a very clever manipulative political technique in order to make sure that they agree to a very reasoned and well worked out dogmatic constitution on papal infallibility for terror of the idea of papal infallibility being proclaimed by acclamation in St. Peter's Basilica. So now, But the problem is that, and one of the problems which has resulted from Vatican I is that, it had to end early for reasons we'll get to in a second, but also it was the liberals were trying to distort what was going to be defined in regard to papal infallibility and universal jurisdiction in order to scare people into not accepting the definition after it was given and into opposing it before it was. So they depict it as a kind of the Pope is an oracle inspired by God who just produces essentially new pages of scripture with every encyclical. And so they're deliberately caricaturing it in order to try and create this impression, in order to prevent it from being promulgated, and then once it is, to try and get people to refuse to accept it. And then you've got some other people like the editor of L'Univers, of the Universe, which is a big Louis Vuillot, who's a big, very sort of fire-breathingly ultramontane, popular Catholic newspaper in France at the time, and he says some loose things on that point as well. And this guy Wilfred Ward in England, he also likes, talks about how he looks forward to the day when he can receive a new infallible definition together with his newspaper on his breakfast table every morning. And this sort of thing is really freaking people out. So you've got the kind of hyper-Montanist people who are massively overemphasizing and distorting the doctrine of papal infallibility. And then you've got the liberals who are doing exactly the same thing in order to scare people into opposing the definition of papal infallibility. Meanwhile, the much more sensible actual theologians and bishops at the council are slowly putting together the actual dogmatic constitution, Pastor Eternus, on the infallible magisterium and universal jurisdiction of the Roman Pontiff, and which contains a number of solemn definitions in it. And so the first remedy for hyper-Montanism is to go and read the actual definition of papal infallibility, which is grand and powerful and defines the Pope to have very great powers over the whole church and the power to teach infallibly, but is very well argued and also makes it clear the narrow conditions in which that infallibility is actually realized. And the second thing to do after actually reading the document is to buy Ignatius Press, if you'll allow me to quote the title of a rival publisher, published this speech under the title "The Gift of Infallibility," which is the relatio, which is the final speech which Bishop Gasser of Brixen, which is now in Italy, but was then in Austria. He gives. He's in charge of the commission which is putting together the dogmatic constitution on papal infallibility, and over the course of the construction of the constitution's drafts, what happens is different drafts are given to the Council Fathers. They sometimes vote on whether they like it, don't like it, or like it but with amendments. And if you don't get a moral unanimity, so like an overwhelming majority of people in favour without amendments, then you go back to the drawing board. And when you go back to the drawing board, suggestions for edits are sent in by the bishops. And before each vote, when a draft could potentially be passed, the relator gives, in this case, Bishop Gasser, gives a speech explaining what the relatio, in which he explains which amendments were incorporated by the drafting committee and which weren't, and why, and what the meaning of different parts of the document is. So this speech is really, really important because it's the last speech given before the final vote in which papal infallibility is actually defined. And he goes through the whole of the document and explains why he included certain things and why he didn't include others and what different things mean and why. So although it's not an infallible or even a magisterial document in itself, it's absolutely key to the correct interpretation of Pastor Eternus, and it's cited 4 times by Vatican II. In fact, when Vatican II is in Lumen Gentium is explaining again the doctrine of papal infallibility, it cites Gasser's speech. So it's really, really important to read. Now, but in the meantime, something weird's happened. So basically, Isabella II of Spain, who's a bit useless, is deposed as the Queen of Spain. And a bunch of liberals take over Spain, but they're relatively conservative liberals, and they want Spain to still be a monarchy. But there's a big dispute. There's already a dispute over the succession of Isabella II, which would take forever to explain, which led to the Carlist Wars. And yes, it's much too complicated. So they, instead of going, and they're very conservative, the Carlists, the followers of the rival candidate to Isabella years back, they're much more conservative and integralist than the, in fact, is Spain where that term originally arises to mean not Disneyland, but real Christendom. So having deposed Isabella, the people who deposed Isabella II, they don't want to replace her with the ultra conservative Carlist candidate. So instead, they decide to ditch the Spanish royal dynasty altogether and just pick another dynasty. There's a lot of this happens in the 19th century from somewhere else. So they decide, well, the Prussians are getting quite powerful, and the Prussians, the Hohenzollern dynasty, one of the branches of the Hohenzollern dynasty never went Protestant. In fact, they end up becoming the kings of Romania, but at this point they're actually Catholics. But they are still Hohenzollerns, and they're still the cousins of the kings of Prussia. So they say, well, why don't the other Hohenzollerns? Why don't you could become your Leopold, whatever he's called, the head of that branch, could become the king of Spain, and that means they'd be forever friends with the Prussians, and that seems like a good idea. Now, Napoleon III is already really, really concerned about the fact that the Prussians are getting much, much more powerful, and they're going to become a big problem, and some, because basically the fact that they take over Germany is what causes the world wars and the European Union. So they're right to be worried, but they've left it a little bit late in the day. They've been kind of feeding the tiger of Italian nationalism and not doing anything about the tiger of German nationalism. And so Napoleon III is like, no. There's no way we're going to have a Hohenzollern in Spain. We're not going to have Hohenzollerns in Germany and Hohenzollerns in Spain. And Prussia, it borders France at this point, even though it shouldn't. That's crazy. Prussia is like way off to the east traditionally, and is most of what was originally Prussia is now in Poland. But at the Congress of Vienna, they gave loads of territories in the Rhineland that used to be little territories ruled just by a local knight or by a local bishop that were eaten for breakfast by the French revolutionaries very quickly. So at the Congress of Vienna, they decided, well, in case the French get out of control again, we can't have just these little teeny weeny statelets ruling the Rhineland. We're going to just give the Rhineland to Prussia. And so then a scary military power will be standing there holding the border against France. They didn't realize that the scary military power of the 20th century wasn't going to be France, it was going to be Germany. But anyway, so they give them this territory. So Napoleon III is like, oh, no way, we're not having the Hohenzollerns taking over Spain. So he sends off an ambassador to go and see the King of Prussia, Wilhelm I. And the King of Prussia says, and he wants a promise from the King of Prussia that he's not going to allow his cousin to take over Spain. And Wilhelm I gives him this promise. He meets him at this spa resort called Ems. And Wilhelm I says, yeah, okay, fine, yeah, I agree, that is a bit too much. And so that's apparently the end of it. But Wilhelm II then sends a telegram to Bismarck, his minister president, in which he says, yeah, the French ambassador came, and I said, yeah, no, we won't go with that, because that's too rude and over the top, and we won't allow cousin to take over Spain. And mind you, he kept going on about it, and it was a bit irritating. He kept going, the French ambassador kept saying, I want a promise that no prince of the House of Hohenzollern will ever consider ever going on Spain, ever taking over Spain ever again. They'll never go on holiday. They'll never eat any whatever paella. There's no so Wilhelm I is a little bit annoyed. So I think, in fact, the conversation was relatively civilized, but I think the French ambassador was a little bit too bumptious. And Wilhelm I, sorry, did I say second? Wilhelm I says to Bismarck in this private telegram, that he was rather rude. Bismarck is a cunning swine and has had this plan being hatched for ages. So basically, he gets the telegram and he edits it slightly. I think he famously moves a comma somewhere in order to give the impression that Wilhelm I was more annoyed than he actually was and was a bit rude to the French ambassador. And then he leaks it to the press. But in France, there's this kind of big nationalist sort of concern about the Prussians and where they're going with their increasing power in Germany. And so then they're desperate to sort of crush the Prussians. And Napoleon III's never really won any significant victories. And so his kind of Napoleonness is looking a bit stale. And he had this silly plan to get one of the Habsburgs on the throne of Mexico that went horribly wrong, and has made him look a bit stupid. So he's getting rather old and he hasn't won any great victories, and he's worried that it's going to be damaging to the prestige of his dynasty, and he's worried about the fact that the Prussians are getting out of control. And so he decides to take enormous offense at this edited telegram and declare war on Germany, on Prussia, which was a terrible mistake and was what Bismarck was planning all along. Anyway, back to Vatican I. The bishops are voting on this final, the final draft of this of Pars Triturnus, and while they vote, a massive thunderstorm gathers over Rome, and they're actually gathered in one of the transepts of St. Peter's Basilica, because there was originally about 700 bishops, and by the time they get to the final vote, it's down to 500 and something, because a lot of the inopportunists decide to go home, because they're put in a difficult position, because they don't, in conscience, don't want to vote for papal infallibility, but they don't actually, most of them don't actually disagree with papal infallibility. So they don't want to vote against a dogmatic constitution that they actually think contains true teaching, but they also wish that it wasn't being promulgated. So instead they decide to go home. So by this point, you've got 500 and something bishops still present in the Basilica, and a massive thunderstorm strikes up, and the sky goes completely black. And you've got these altar boys running around St. Peter's Basilica trying to relight candles, because, you know, there's drafts from the howling winds outside getting into the Basilica and blowing out the candles, and people are trying to vote, and they all have to vote one after another, right? So they stand up and they say whether they accept or don't accept or accept with changes the final draft. So they stand up in increasing darkness because the candle's constantly being blown out and not lit again fast enough, and then they'll say, "I accept." And then boom, boom, there's a massive thunder strike, and the entire basilica lights up like daylight for a split second and then goes completely black again. And the terrified bishop sits down. And it goes on to the next bishop who has to stand up. So I mean, you can't really imagine more dramatic circumstances for the voting through of a dogma by an ecumenical council. And so finally, it's overwhelmingly voted. In fact, only 2 bishops vote against it in the end, in the final vote. So it is, I think it would count as moral unanimity, even if the opportunists hadn't gone home, inopportunists hadn't gone home. And one of the 2 bishops, amusingly, is the Bishop of Little Rock, Arkansas. I don't know if you're aware of that, but he was one of the 2 who held out against papal infallibility. And those 2 bishops throw themselves on their knees in front of Pius IX and submit to Pius IX pronounces his own ratification of the dogma, and papal infallibility and universal jurisdiction is infallibly defined. And then the 2 final dissenting bishops throw themselves on their knees in front of Pius IX and submit to the dogma of papal infallibility. So it's all very impressive. And then the next day, France declares war on Germany, and France declares war on Prussia. And as a result, they get really worried that the Prussians are going to do an alliance with the Italians to invade France from the south, and that wouldn't be a big problem because the Italians don't seem to be very difficult to beat. But it would be a distraction from the war. So they decide, and they think, well, the Italians can use as a casus belli, as a pretext for going to war, the fact that we're feeling that we've got French troops in the Papal States. So Napoleon III decides to stop the Italians having a pretext for attacking France. He pulls the French troops out of the Papal States. So it becomes clear immediately that the Italian nationalist government is now going to invade the Papal States. So most of the bishops go home. So some bishops remain, but not for very long. So there's a few more discussions of different schemas, but in the end, the Pope has to suspend the council indefinitely. And as I say, it doesn't get formally closed until the late 50s or 60s. I can't remember which point it is that John 23rd actually. But it's after he announces he's going to summon a new council, he dissolves Vatican I. There's all this misinformation that's disseminated about the definition of papal infallibility, causes a lot of reticence, but slowly various people who were inopportunists, most famously St. John Henry Newman was an inopportunist for the last of the three reasons I listed. He thought that it would lead to incontinent issuing of documents by popes, and also he thought that people would ignore anything that wasn't an infallible definition, although in fact that wasn't really what happened. What happens is people ignored everything, including the infallible definitions of it. Well, you've got the kind of neoconservatives in the church who treat absolutely everything, every burp and scratching behind the ear of a pope is treated as an ex cathedra definition, and then you've got the liberals who treat nothing as definitive at all whatsoever, which has been the sort of side effect of the definition of papal infallibility. But they slowly, one by one, as they kind of digest the dogma and understand that the disinformation about the rigging of the council is all false, various people submit. The Ignaz von Dollinger is become completely hysterical and only ever listens to his own propaganda, and he refuses to submit and is excommunicated by his bishop. In the end, the German bishops all give in, including very reluctantly, after a long time, the bishop who wrote the procedural rules and was opposed to the definition. He finally drags from his own teeth the submission to the dogma of papal infallibility. But a group of some opponents refuse to submit, and they call themselves the Old Catholics, and they find some Jansenist bishops who've been in schism from Rome for a long time now in the Netherlands to come to Germany and Switzerland and start ordaining a new line of anti-infallibilist bishops and create what's called the Old Catholic Church, which still exists. I've seen. I didn't go in because I didn't want to be struck dead by the Almighty for entering the premises. But I saw an Old Catholic Church in Linz in Austria once. But they still exist. But almost immediately, really immediately, basically, they become super liberal. So they abolish like all penance and fasting, and they start having married clergy, and I think they have female clergy and stuff now as well. And they've got so liberal now that the Holy See doesn't recognise the validity of their orders anymore, which is handy because the Anglicans, when the Anglicans start panicking about the invalidity of their orders, they often scurry off to try and find an Old Catholic bishop to secretly reordain them. But now, fortunately, the Old Catholic bishops have gone so crazy that they've invalidated their own orders. So that sneaky path has been closed off. And of course, they call it the Dutch touch in the Church of England. It's this kind of, sort of a nun friend of mine called it the Frankenstein's monster ecclesiology. You try and create a church out of the rotting flesh of various dead churches. You try and sew them back together and get some Jansenist lightning into the body in order to get it back together again, but it doesn't work. So 2 months later, the Italian nationalists storm the city of Rome, and Pius IX is Pius IX. He's very emotional, Pius IX, and he's actually quite pro-Italian unification, even though he's very upset about how it happened. And he used to get like a Vittor Emmanuel II, the king of Sardinia, whose regime has created this Italian nationalist state. Who's actually had a long and friendly correspondence with, despite the fact that politically speaking they were bitter enemies. He used to get his secretary to read out to him accounts of the victories of Vittor Emmanuel, and he used to weep for joy at the fact that his friend had won these great victories against him. And you're like, what? Pius IX is very keen that there shouldn't be a bloodbath in the final defense of Rome, greatly to the annoyance of all these volunteers from all over the world. There's one in the English College Chapel in Rome. There's the tomb of an Englishman who died defending the Papal States against the Italian nationalists. But Pius IX doesn't want a bloodbath, whereas all the volunteers, the Papal Zouaves, as they're called, they're really keen to like die. It's like the new crusade. We're going to die for the Holy Father, and so. But he sends out orders at the last minute that they must basically fire a few shots against the invading nationalists, in order to show that it wasn't, that he didn't concede, because the Italian government sends these letters saying, for the sake of order and peace, don't you think now you ought to just let us have the paper? And he's like, no, I will not be blackmailed. Order, you're the ones creating disorder. So he refuses to give in, but he doesn't want to actually have people die for the sake of his states, because he hates that idea. And I mean, it's very Italian sentiment. Whenever Italian soldiers get kidnapped abroad, by the Taliban or whatever, unlike the Brits and the Americans, the Italians immediately pay the ransom. And it's very, there's an admirable, in its way, sense of desire not to see people die unnecessarily. But anyway, Pius IX says that they must fire a few shots and then wave the white flag and surrender Rome to the Italian nationalists. But it must be a surrender in battle. It can't be an agreed legal transfer. It must be clear that it was taken by illegitimate force. And then from that point onwards, Pius IX lives another 8 years. But from that point onwards, the popes until the late 20s, are the prisoners of the Vatican, locked up in the Leonine city, the area around St. Peter's itself. The Quirinal Palace, which is the official residence of the Pope, is the Italians smash down the doors and hand it over to become the residence of the King of Italy and now of the President of Italy. But the popes, as it were, like Aeneas taking the Palladium from the ruins of Troy, the Pope drag from the ruins of their states and from the ruined attempt of the Vienna Conference to recreate Christendom, the one last superpower, which is the solemn definition of papal infallibility and universal ordinary jurisdiction, which is going to make them the unquestioned absolute monarchs of the Church for the first time in the history of the papacy, from which the dramatic and terrifying events of the 21st Ecumenical Council will arise.
And we'll save that for next week. Doctor, great. Thank you as always.